In the world we know, Jon Snow grows up in Winterfell's shadow, loved by his father, shunned by his father's wife, trained alongside true-born sons but never their equal. When the time comes, he takes the black and rides to the wall, trading one kind of cold for another. But what if the greatest living knight in Westeros came north and recognized a gift buried inside the bastard boy that no one else could name? What if Barristan Selmy took Jon Snow under his sword and forged him into something the realm has never seen? Settle in tonight and let the world go quiet. This is the story of the boy who learned what it means to be a knight. Barristan Selmy rode through the gates of Winterfell on a grey morning in the waning days of 289, with the iron-born boy behind him and 3 men-at-arms on the road. The ward, Theon Greyjoy, 10 years old and thin, lipped with fury, sat his horse without speaking, and Barristan had not tried to make him. The boy had watched his father kneel. He had watched his brothers burn. Whatever Theon Greyjoy would become inside these walls, he would arrive at it in his own time, and Barristan respected that, even if he did not envy it. Ned Stark met them in the yard. He looked older than the last time Barristan had seen him, which had been on the steps of the Iron Throne, with a dead king's blood still cooling on the floor. That memory sat between them like a stone neither man would name. Ned took the Greyjoy boy by the shoulder without roughness and handed him to a steward, then clasped Barristan's arm and said, "You've ridden a long way, Sir Barristan. Rest, eat, we'll talk after." Barristan intended to stay 3 days. Robert had given him leave to deliver the ward and see the north, and 3 days seemed enough for both. He bathed. He ate mutton and dark bread in the great hall while the wind howled outside. He walked the walls and looked out at a landscape so vast and empty that the Red Keep felt like a birdcage by comparison. On the second morning, he found the practice yard. A boy was fighting there, small, dark-haired, maybe 6 or 7. He had a wooden sword, and he was hacking at a straw dummy with more fury than technique. And an older boy, Ned's true-born heir, Robb, auburn-haired and laughing, was shouting encouragement from the fence. The dark boy did not laugh back. He attacked the dummy again, and this time, Barristan stopped walking. The footwork. The shift of weight before the swing, not after, the way untrained boys always did, but before, leading with the hips and letting the arms follow. No one had taught a 7-year-old bastard to transfer his weight like a swordsman twice his age. The movement lived in the boy's body, the way a song lives in the hands of a child who has never been shown a harp. Barristan leaned against the fence and watched. The boy landed 3 strikes in clean succession, adjusted his grip without being corrected, and then overreached and fell. Robb jumped down to help him up. The dark boy pushed the hand away and stood on his own. "Who is that?" Barristan asked Sir Roderick Castle, the master-at-arms, who had wandered over to stand beside him. "Jon Snow, Lord Stark's natural son." Barristan watched the boy dust himself off and attack the dummy again. The overreach was gone. He had read his own mistake and fixed it between one breath and the next. How old? 7, just past his name day. 7 years old. Barristan had trained squires twice that age who could not correct their own footwork in a week of drilling. He watched a moment longer, and something shifted in his chest, an old ache turning over. A door he had sealed shut years ago, rattling on its hinges. Jon Snow fought with a dead man's rhythm, and Barristan could not look away. He stayed a 4th day. On the morning of his 4th day at Winterfell, Barristan asked Ned for permission. They sat in Ned's solar with the fire burning low and the sound of hammers rising from the smithy below. Ned leaned back in his chair and studied Barristan the way a man studies a river before deciding whether to cross it. "You want to train my bastard. I want to show him a few things," Barristan said. "A few corrections. His instincts are raw, but sound. And he reads distance the way most grown men never learn to. With proper guidance, he's 7. Prince Rhaegar was 6 when he first held a sword." The name dropped into the room like a blade falling from a shelf. Ned's expression changed, a tightening behind the eyes, a stillness that had nothing to do with calm, and Barristan cursed himself for saying it. He had not meant to compare the boy to Rhaegar. He did not understand why the comparison had risen so fast to his tongue. "A few lessons," Ned said after a pause. "If the boy wants them." Jon wanted them. They began that afternoon in the practice yard, with Robb watching from the fence and Theon Greyjoy sitting in the mud a dozen paces away, arms crossed, refusing to participate. Barristan handed Jon a proper wooden training sword, weighted and balanced, not the splintered stick he had been using, and told him to attack. Jon swung hard. Barristan sidestepped and tapped the back of the boy's knee, buckling it. Jon fell. Up, Jon got up. Again, Jon swung. Barristan moved. Jon hit the ground. "When you attack," Barristan said, crouching so his eyes were level with the boy's, "you pour all your weight into a single outcome. If the outcome changes, you fall. Don't pour. Stay balanced. Let the sword find its edge on its own." Jon's brow furrowed. The lesson was too large for him, but his body heard it anyway. On the fourth attempt, when Barristan shifted left, Jon adjusted, a half step, barely visible, and the old knight had to bring his own blade up to deflect rather than simply dodge. Neither of them spoke about it. They did not need to. From a window above the yard, Lady Catelyn watched with her hands folded over the swell of her belly and her mouth pressed into a bloodless line. The greatest knight in the Seven Kingdoms had come to Winterfell, and he had chosen to spend his time on the bastard. She had no words for it, only a resentment that would outlast the season. By the end of the first week, Jon was blocking 1 strike in 3. By the end of the fortnight, he was counter-attacking. Barristan's leave from Robert should have ended days ago. He wrote a letter requesting more time, 3 sentences long, no mention of the boy, and sent it south by Raven. Robert's reply came a month later. "Stay as long as you like, old friend. Jaime and the others can hold the fort. Gods know I won't need guarding from anything worse than a wine barrel." Barristan folded the letter and stayed. The first time the resemblance became impossible to dismiss, Jon was 8 years old, and the snow was falling thick across the yard. Barristan had set him a drill, a sequence of 6 strikes that looped back on itself, each flowing into the next without rest. It was a drill Barristan had learnt at Blackhaven when he was 12, and it required not just speed, but a kind of physical memory that most fighters never developed. You had to stop thinking and let the blade move through you. Jon had been working the sequence for a week. He managed the first 4 strikes well enough. The 5th, a reverse cut that demanded rotating the wrist at the apex of the swing, defeated him every time. His hand was not strong enough. The angle refused to come. On this morning, in the snow, he tried again. 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the 5th strike, his whole body realigned. The wrist turned, the shoulder dipped. The blade came around in a clean arc, and the 6th strike followed as naturally as an exhale. Barristan stood very still. He had seen that exact movement, the drop of the leading shoulder, the way the wrist led the elbow through the turn, once before in his life. On a tourney field at Harrenhal, 20 years past, when a silver-haired prince had unhorsed every knight in the realm and crowned a northern girl with winter roses. Jon looked up, breathing hard, and grinned. "I did it." "Yes," Barristan said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. "You did." That evening he went to Ned's solar. The fire was high, and Ned was reading a letter from Benjen at the wall. He set it down when Barristan entered and waited as Ned always waited, still, patient, giving nothing. "Your boy," Barristan said, and then stopped. He did not know how to say what he had come to say. Perhaps there was no way to say it that would not break something fragile and old between them. Ned's grey eyes held steady. "Your boy fights like someone I once served with. He fights like his father, I expect," Ned said, and his voice was flat and final and utterly closed, like a gate barred from the inside. The fire cracked. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. Barristan let the silence sit. "I would like to continue his training," he said at last. "Not for a fortnight or a moon's turn, for years. The boy has a gift. Ned, it would be a sin against the gods, old and new, to let it go to waste." Ned stared into the flames. His face gave nothing, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair until the knuckles went white. "Stay," he said. "Train him. Train Robb too, and the Greyjoy boy if he'll submit to it." But Jon stays in Winterfell. He does not leave the north, not ever. Barristan heard the fear beneath the command. He did not understand its source, not fully, not yet, but he recognized its depth, and he nodded. "I'll write to Robert, I already have." The years moved like weather across the north, vast grey stretches broken by sudden changes that arrived without warning and left marks on everything they touched. Jon at 8 was a boy who could hold a proper stance and follow instructions without complaint. Jon at 10 was something else entirely. He sparred with Robb every morning and trained with Barristan every afternoon. And the gap between the two boys widened with each passing season. Robb was good, strong, quick, courageous, everything a lord's heir should be. Jon carried a different kind of talent, an instinct for the space between movements, a feel for what was coming before it arrived. Robb fought what stood in front of him. Jon fought what was about to happen. Barristan trained them together when he could, because it sharpened both, and because Ned wanted his sons, all of them, growing up as brothers. But the solitary sessions with Jon were where the deeper work happened. They trained in the Godswood when the yard was too icy, among the weirwood roots with red leaves falling like slow drops of blood around them. They trained in the great hall after dark, pushing the tables aside and working by torchlight while the servants whispered. Once they trained on the frozen surface of the winter pools, and Jon broke through the ice and came up laughing with his lips blue and his practice sword still gripped in his fist. Theon Greyjoy watched all of it with the expression of a boy who had been born on the wrong island. He trained alongside Robb when Barristan permitted it, but his pride would not let him ask for individual instruction, and Barristan did not offer any. The Ironborn boy had a serviceable sword arm and a worse attitude, and Barristan had spent enough years in the company of ambitious men to recognize one wearing a mask of indifference. Jon at 12 rode a horse as though he had been born in the saddle. Barristan taught him mounted combat that spring, lance work, horseback swordplay, the precise art of turning a charge into a flanking pass. And Jon took to it with the same grim focus he brought to everything, a concentration that made him look far older than his years. The horse Ned gave him was a stocky northern gelding, nothing like a war horse, but Jon moved it as if it weighed nothing at all. "He rides like a Southron knight," Maester Lewin remarked to Barristan one evening. Watching Jon take the gelding through figure-8 patterns in the far paddock, with the stirrups long, like a tawny rider. Barristan said nothing to that. There was nothing safe to say. Catelyn Stark had more to offer on the subject. Not to Barristan, they maintained a civil distance that neither attempted to close, but to Ned. In conversations that bled through stone walls, if a man stood in the right corridor, the bastard was being elevated beyond his station. The bastard was being treated as though his blood ran equal to her children's. The bastard had a knight of the Kingsguard sleeping in the chamber next to his and training him as though he were the true-born heir of a great house. "He's a boy with a gift," Ned told her, and Catelyn's answering silence said more than any words could. Through all of it, Barristan taught Jon about more than steel. He taught him history, the conquest and the battles that followed, the Blackfire rebellions, the dance of the dragons. He told Jon about the knights he had served beside, and the ones he had fought against. And when he spoke of Prince Rhaegar, he spoke with the reverence of a man remembering a saint, and Jon listened to those stories most intently of all. "What was he like?" Jon asked once, sitting on the great weirwood roots with his practice sword across his knees. He was 11 then, all elbows and dark eyes and questions. Barristan took a long time before answering. "He was the finest man I ever fought beside," he said, "and I failed him." Jon wanted to ask more, but the old knight's face told him to wait. He would return to the question later. There would be time. There was always time, until there wasn't. The trouble with the Hornwood boy came in Jon's 13th year. Lord Haley's Hornwood brought his heir to Winterfell for a harvest feast, and the boy, Darren, a year older than Jon, and already wide across the shoulders, heard the stories about the bastard who trained with a Kingsguard knight and wanted to test them. He found Jon in the yard and demanded a bout. It lasted less than a minute. Jon disarmed Darren with a bind and twist that Barristan had shown him, a technique that turned an opponent's grip into a lever and put the older boy on his back in the mud. Clean, quick, final. Darren lay there, blinking, and then stood and spat a mouthful of dirt and said, "My father is a lord." "What is yours? At least I have a name." "Snow," Jon hit him. Not with a blade and not with a practice sword, with his fist, hard, across the jaw. Darren's lips split open. Blood ran into the mud, and Jon stood over him with his hand still clenched and nothing in his eyes but fury. Barristan pulled him back before it went further. They walked to the godswood. Barristan did not speak until Jon's breathing had slowed and the colour had drained from his neck. Then the old knight sat on a root of the heart tree beneath the carved face with its red weeping eyes and told Jon a story he had never told anyone. "When I was a boy at Blackhaven, a squire named Garrett mocked me every day for my size. I was small then, you wouldn't credit it now, and he called me Little Barry. Told the others I would never reach a stirrup, let alone swing a lance. One afternoon I caught him alone in the stables and beat him until they had to carry him to the maester." Jon looked at him. "What happened? My lord father made me muck the stables for a month. But the worst punishment was this. Garrett never sparred with me again. Not because he was frightened. Because he had seen what I became when I lost myself, and he wanted nothing to do with it. I had won the fight, and lost the man." The red leaves drifted around them. Jon said nothing. "There was a knight once," Barristan continued. "Sir Duncan the Tall. Born with nothing, no family name, no lands, no gold, no patron. A hedge knight, the lowest rung of our order. He died as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the most honoured post in the realm. Do you want to know how?" Jon nodded. "Because he learned that knighthood is not a title someone gives you. It is a practice. It is what you do when the world insults you, when the fight is unfair, when the boy bleeding in the mud calls you a bastard. If you answer cruelty with your fists, you become what they already believe you are. If you answer it with grace, you make them liars." Jon did not apologize to Darren Hornwood. Barristan did not ask him to. But 2 days later, at the farewell feast, Jon walked to where Darren sat and set a cup of wine in front of him and offered a nod. Darren, whose jaw was still swollen and whose pride was still raw, hesitated, and then took the cup and drank. After that day, Jon did not fight with his fists again. The anger never left him. It never would. But Barristan had given him something stronger than rage, a standard to hold himself against, a shape he could grow into even without a name to fill it. Jon turned 14 in the deep of winter, when the drifts climbed halfway up Winterfell's walls and the godswood was a cathedral of white silence. He was taller now, lean, long-armed, with stark colouring and a face balanced between youth and something harder. He fought with a grace that made grown men stop whatever they were doing and watch. The northern lords who came through Winterfell brought their best young swordsmen to the practice yard, and Jon handled them one after another, and those lords went home carrying stories about Ned Stark's bastard who moved like a man twice his years. But the yard was not the Great Hall, and a sword was not a surname. The winter feast fell on the longest night. The hall blazed with fire. The lords and their wives and their true-born heirs sat at the high table, and Jon sat at the far end of the lower table near the door, among the squires and household guards. This was Catelyn's arrangement, and it had never changed. The bastard did not eat beside her children. The bastard did not sit where guests might confuse him with someone of consequence. Jon ate without complaint. He was accustomed to the placement by now. The sting had dulled over the years, worn smooth by repetition, until it felt less like a wound and more like a scar, always present, seldom sharp, impossible to forget. Barristan appeared beside him. The old knight had been seated in the place of honour at the high table, next to Ned. Half the lords in the hall watched him rise and cross the room and lower himself onto the bench next to the bastard boy, and their watching was a statement of its own. "You should be up there," Jon said. "I'm where I choose to be." They ate. The fire cracked, and a singer played a northern ballad about a woman who waited by the shore for a ship that never returned. Jon set down his cup and stared at the grain of the table. "Where do I go?" he asked. "When I'm grown. When this is finished. The wall?" Benjen says there's honor in the Night's Watch, but when he talks about it, his eyes look like a man describing a prison he's learned to love. Barristan turned his cup between his palms. He had served 3 kings and survived a dozen wars, and the question this boy was asking was harder than any battle he had ever faced. "Sir Duncan had even less than you," he said. "No father, no home, no one to show him which end of the sword to grip. He walked the roads with a painted shield and a half-dead horse. And he became the greatest knight who ever lived. Not because the world gave him an opening. Because he made one. He wasn't a bastard. He was worse. He was no one at all. And he chose to be someone. That is the only choice that matters, Jon. Names are words. What lives in your sword arm and in your heart, that endures." Jon wanted to believe it. On nights like this, belief came harder than it should have. They finished the meal. Barristan returned to the high table to satisfy courtesy, and Jon went to the battlements alone and stood in the cold and tilted his face toward a sky so clear and black and deep that a man could fall upward into it and never land. Below him the castle breathed its smoky warmth through 100 chimneys, and somewhere inside those walls his brothers slept, his father sat. The life he belonged to and did not belong to existed in the same breath. He had stood in this same spot 1,000 times. He would stand here 1,000 more if the gods allowed it. But a feeling had settled into his bones over the past year. A restlessness. A sense of something approaching, like the vibration in the ground before a distant cavalry charge that the ear cannot yet hear, but the body already feels. A raven had arrived that morning. Maester Lewin had read it and gone straight to Ned, and Ned had said nothing at supper, but Jon had watched his father's face and seen it change. The raven bore the royal seal. King Robert Baratheon was riding north. The direwolf pups were found on the day Jon's childhood ended, though he did not know it at the time. Ned had ridden out at dawn with a small party to execute a deserter from the Night's Watch, a wild-eyed man who babbled about dead things walking in the forest and blue eyes that burned in the dark. The law was the law. Ned swung ice himself, because the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and that was the Stark way, and always had been. On the ride home, they found the mother. She lay in the snow beside the King's Road, enormous, larger than any wolf Jon had ever seen or imagined. A direwolf, a beast that should not have existed south of the wall, that had not been seen in the north for centuries. She was dead, a broken antler buried in her throat, and around her body, mewling and blind and wet with birth, 5 pups nursed from a corpse, one for each of Ned's true-born children. 5 pups, 5 Stark heirs, 5 direwolves, the sigil of the house, made flesh. Jon had ridden with the party. He stood over the dead mother and counted the pups and did the arithmetic in his head. 5 pups, 5 Starks, and the number told him what it always told him. He was not included. He was not counted. The wolves were a sign from the old gods, and the old gods had not sent one for the bastard. "There's not one for you," Theon observed, with the smile of a man who enjoys watching someone else receive bad news. Jon said nothing. He turned to go. And then he heard it, a sound so faint it should have been buried under the wind and the horses and the creak of leather saddles. A thin, high cry, coming from the ditch beside the road, from beneath a shelf of frozen snow. He knelt, he brushed the snow aside, and he found the 6th pup. White, pure white, from nose to tail, without a single mark of color. Its eyes were still closed, but when Jon lifted it from the snow and held it against his chest, the pup did not cry. It settled into the warmth of his body with a stillness that felt less like calm and more like recognition, as though the wolf had been waiting for precisely this pair of hands. "An albino," Theon said. "The runt. It'll die before the week is out." "He won't die," Jon said. He did not know why he was certain, But he was. The pup's heartbeat thumped against his palm, fast and fierce, and the white fur was warm beneath his fingers, and the world had sent a wolf for the bastard after all. He named the pup Ghost. Barristan watched from his horse and said nothing. But that evening, in the privacy of Jon's chamber, with the white pup sleeping in a box of straw beside the bed, the old knight sat and looked at the direwolf for a long time. "The sigil of House Stark," Barristan said. 6 pups for 6 children. 5 children and a bastard. 6 children, Barristan said. "Whatever the world calls you, that wolf does not care about the name Snow." Animals see what men refuse to see. Ghost opened his red eyes. They were red, Jon had discovered, the color of weirwood leaves, the color of the old god's tears, and stared at Barristan with a gaze that held no judgment and no compromise. And the old knight inclined his head to the wolf the way he had once inclined his head to kings. Over the following weeks, as Robert's caravan drew closer to Winterfell, Ghost grew. He grew fast, and he grew silent. He did not howl like his siblings, did not bark, did not make any sound at all. He followed Jon everywhere, a white shadow on 4 legs, and the bond between them deepened into something that had no name in any language Jon spoke. When Jon trained in the yard, Ghost sat at the edge and watched with those red eyes. And when Jon ate in the hall, still at the lower table, still exiled from his family, Ghost lay at his feet, and the weight of the wolf's head on his boot was the only warmth Jon needed. Barristan observed the bond and filed it away in the place where he kept the things he noticed about Jon Snow: the fighting style, the horsemanship, the dark coloring in a family of auburn and blue. And now the direwolf with eyes the color of blood. A collection of details that, taken together, formed a picture Barristan was not sure he wanted to see completed. The royal column reached Winterfell on a morning in the first month of 298, 9 years after Barristan had first ridden through these gates with an ironborn hostage behind him. He had not left since. His white cloak hung in a wardrobe in his chamber, folded but not forgotten, and twice a year he received letters from Robert asking when he planned to return. And twice a year he wrote back that the northern air agreed with his old bones. Robert always laughed at that, or so the return letters claimed. The king had other Kingsguard. He did not need Barristan. He needed his wine and his hunts and his memory of a dead woman, and those things required no protection. But now Robert himself was coming north, and Barristan stood in the yard beside Jon and watched the column approach. 300 riders, the Lannister lion flying beside the crowned stag, wheelhouses and baggage carts, and enough supplies for a small war. The king rode at the front, enormous in the saddle, his beard thick and his belly thicker, and Barristan felt the years like a fist closing around his throat. This was not the Robert he remembered. This was the ruin of him. Ned greeted the king. The queen dismounted with the cold precision of a woman who found the north beneath her. Children spilled out of the wheelhouse, golden-haired, green-eyed children who looked nothing like the dark Baratheon line, and Barristan filed that observation in a place where he kept things he did not yet wish to examine. It was Jon who drew Robert's attention. After the formal greetings, after the feast was planned and the chambers assigned, Robert wandered to the practice yard as he always did in a new place, restless, looking for something to remind him of the man he used to be. He found Jon sparring with Robb. The bout was not close. Robb was strong and well-trained and brave, and Jon dismantled him in 8 exchanges, the last of which ended with Robb's sword spinning from his grip and landing point first in the frozen ground 3 yards away. Robb laughed. Jon did not. Robert clapped once, hard, 7 hells. "Who is that?" "My son Jon," Ned said, standing beside him. The word bastard did not leave his mouth. "Your boy fights better than half the knights in my Kingsguard." "Barristan, is that your doing?" "He came with the talent," Barristan said. "I sharpened it." Robert stared at Jon the way a man stares at a fine horse he wants to buy. "Bring him south. A fighter like that is wasted up here, freezing his sword arm off. I'll make him a knight. I'll give him a keep." "He stays in Winterfell," Ned said, and the tone was the same one he had used 9 years ago. Iron poured into words. Robert's visit lasted a fortnight. In that time he asked Ned to serve as Hand of the King, and Ned agreed, because Robert asked, and because Jon Arryn was dead, and because duty had always been the loudest voice in Eddard Stark's head. Sansa would go south to marry Joffrey. Arya would go with her. The household would move. The question of Jon hung unresolved until the final night. Barristan went to Ned after the feast. They stood on the battlements where Jon liked to stand, looking out at the dark. "Take me with you," Barristan said. "I've been away from my duties long enough. And take the boy. No, he can serve as my squire. I'll keep him close. I'll keep him safe." "You can't keep anyone safe in that city." "I couldn't. Jon Arryn couldn't." "Ned," Barristan turned to face him, "if you leave him here with Lady Catelyn and no protector, he will end up at the wall within the year. You know this. She will insist, and there will be no one to speak for him. Is that what you want? The wall?" The wind moved across the battlements. Ned's face was stone, but the stone was cracking. "If anything happens to him," Ned said, "I will hold you responsible. Before men and before gods. Do you understand me, Sir Barristan?" "I do." "Then take him south and bring him home alive." Jon had never been farther from Winterfell than a day's ride. Now the north fell away behind him like a dream surrendering to morning, and each day brought a landscape more foreign than the last, rolling green hills, rivers that ran warm, fields of wheat and barley that stretched to the horizon without a single pine to break the line. He rode near the front of the column with Barristan, ahead of the wheelhouse, but behind the king's immediate guard. Ned rode with Robert. Sansa rode in the wheelhouse with the queen and talked about the capital as though she were already a princess, and Arya rode where she pleased, which was usually as far from Sansa as a horse could carry her. On the third day, Tyrion Lannister fell in beside Jon. The dwarf had been riding at the rear of the column, drinking from a skin and reading a book simultaneously, which struck Jon as either impressive or reckless. He was small and sharp-featured, and his mismatched eyes glittered with an intelligence that made Jon want to sit straighter in the saddle. "So you're Ned Stark's bastard," Tyrion said. "I am, and Barristan the Bold's protege. A bastard trained by the greatest knight alive. The gods do have a sense of humor." He took a drink and offered the skin to Jon, who declined. "I'm a dwarf, in case you hadn't noticed. My father looks at me the way most men look at a puddle they've stepped in. So I understand something about being the wrong shape for the world you were born into." Jon looked at him. "Does it get easier?" "No. But you get better at it, and eventually you learn that the world's opinion of you matters considerably less than your opinion of yourself." Tyrion grinned. "That and a good wine cellar. Never underestimate the restorative properties of a vintage Arbor Gold." They rode together for the rest of the day, and by evening Jon found himself laughing for the first time since leaving Winterfell. Tyrion told stories about the court that made the capital sound like a theatre where every actor was trying to stab the others while reciting their lines, and Jon filed every detail away as Barristan had taught him. Watch, listen, remember. On the 5th day, they crossed the Trident. Barristan reined up at the ford where the river ran shallow over smooth stones, and Jon saw the old knight's face change. "This is where it happened," Jon said. "It was not a question. Robert killed Rhaegar here. In the shallows, where the water runs red at sunset even now. They say the rubies from Rhaegar's breastplate are still in the mud. Fishermen find them sometimes. Were you there? I was wounded before the battle. They carried me off the field at Ashford, and I spent the trident on my back in a tent, listening to the sound of a kingdom dying." Barristan's voice was level, but his hands held the reins too tightly. "I have fought in many battles, Jon. That is the only one I regret missing. Not because I could have changed the outcome, because I should have been there when he fell." They crossed the river. The water was cold and clear, and nothing about it suggested the blood that had once turned it red. King's Landing announced itself by smell before it announced itself by sight, the stench of 500,000 lives pressed together between walls, a reek of smoke and sweat and sewage and the salt rot of Blackwater Bay, so thick that Jon pulled his cloak over his nose, and Barristan, beside him, did not bother. The old knight had breathed this air for decades. He did not notice it anymore. Then the city rose above the horizon, and Jon forgot the smell. It was enormous. Winterfell could have fit inside the walls a dozen times over. The Red Keep sat atop Aegon's hill like a fist of pale stone, its towers catching the late sun. And the great sept of Baelor gleamed on Visenya's hill to the west. Ships crowded the harbour. The streets teemed. Jon had never seen so many people in one place, and the sheer density of it, bodies and buildings and noise, pressed against him like a hand on his chest. They rode through the gates and up the hill to the Red Keep and in the outer yard as Jon was dismounting. A man in white armour stepped out of the shadows and stood watching him. Jaime Lannister was the most handsome man Jon had ever seen and the most unsettling. He had golden hair and green eyes and a jaw that looked carved from marble, and he smiled the way a cat smiles at a mouse it has not yet decided to kill. "Barristan," Jaime said, his voice lazy and amused. "You look old. And you look comfortable, Sir Jaime. I trust you've kept my brothers sharp in my absence. Sharp enough. And who is this?" "Jon Snow. Lord Stark's son. My squire." Jaime's green eyes moved to Jon, and for a heartbeat something crossed his face. Recognition. Or the echo of recognition. A flicker that came and went too fast to name. He studied Jon the way a swordsman studies another swordsman, measuring reach and balance and threat, and whatever he found there made the lazy smile tighten at its edges. "Welcome to King's Landing, Snow," Jaime said. "Try not to let it eat you alive." Jon was given a chamber in the White Sword Tower, a narrow room with a cot and a window that looked out over the Blackwater. He set his pack down and stood at the window and watched the ships move across the bay and tried to feel something other than the uneasy certainty that he had ridden a very long way from everything he had ever known. Barristan found him there. "Tomorrow I resume my duties. You'll attend me. You'll train in the yard in the mornings, serve in the afternoons. And keep your mouth shut and your eyes open at all times. This is not Winterfell, Jon. The North has wolves. This city has worse. What does it have? Men who smile while they sharpen the knife behind their back, and women who do the same with a whisper." Jon looked at the city spread below him, the rooftops, the smoke, the swarming streets, and nodded. Jon's first morning in the capital yard drew a crowd. He had not intended it. He arrived at dawn, as Barristan had taught him, and found the practice swords racked against the wall and a few household knights warming up with lazy cuts at the quintain. He took a sword, tested its weight, and began the 6-strike drill, the one Barristan had taught him at 8, the one he could now perform in his sleep. By the 3rd repetition, the knights had stopped warming up. By the 5th, a dozen men stood along the fence. Jon finished the sequence and turned to find Sandor Clegane leaning against a post with his arms crossed and his burned face arranged into something that was not quite a smile. "Pretty," the hound said. "You fight like a dancer. Can you fight like a man? Try me and find out." The hound barked a laugh. "Give it a few years, boy. When you've killed someone, come talk to me about fighting." Jon said nothing. He filed the words away and went back to his drill. The trouble started 3 days later. Joffrey Baratheon, 12 years old, golden-haired, with his mother's green eyes and an expression that suggested the world existed for his entertainment, saw Jon in the yard and demanded a match. His sworn shield, the hound, tried to dissuade him. Joffrey would not be dissuaded. They sparred with blunted steel. Jon held back for 2 exchanges out of respect for the prince's station, and then Joffrey lunged with a wild overhand cut that would have taken Jon's head if the swords had been sharp, and instinct took over. Jon sidestepped, bound the blade, twisted it from Joffrey's grip, and put the point of his own sword against the prince's chest, all in a motion so fast that the watching knights did not react until it was over. The yard went silent. Joffrey's face was white, his eyes were wet. He opened his mouth to say something cruel, something royal, and then Cersei Lannister's voice cut across the yard like a blade through silk. "Sir Barristan." She stood at the entrance to the yard in a gown of crimson silk, her golden hair catching the sun, and her beauty was a weapon as real as any sword Jon had ever held. Her green eyes locked on Barristan with a fury that did not need raising her voice to communicate. "Keep your pet bastard away from my son," she said, "or I will have words with the king about where northern strays belong." Barristan bowed. His face betrayed nothing. Jon bowed too, because Barristan had taught him that courtesy costs nothing and buys time. They left the yard. Behind them, Joffrey was already shouting at a squire to bring him a new sword, and the hound was watching Jon's retreating back with an expression that had shifted from amusement to something closer to appraisal. "You made an enemy today," Barristan said as they climbed the steps to the White Sword Tower. "He attacked me. I defended myself. In this city, the truth of what happened matters less than the story that gets told about it. And the Queen tells the stories. Remember that." Jon remembered. Jon had not spent much time with his sisters before coming south. In Winterfell, Sansa had been Catelyn's creature, proper, mannered, trained in courtesy and needlework. A girl who saw the world through the lens of the songs and stories she adored. Arya had been the opposite, wild, fierce, more interested in swords than sewing. But Jon's hours in the practice yard with Barristan had left little time for the kind of rough play Arya craved. King's Landing changed that. Sansa was absorbed into Cersei's orbit within days of arrival. She wore southern dresses and adopted southern courtesies, and spoke of Joffrey with a devotion that made Jon's skin crawl. Because he had fought Joffrey in the practice yard and knew what lived beneath the golden hair and the perfect smile. He tried to warn her, once, in the gardens of the Red Keep. "The prince is not what he seems, Sansa. You don't know him. You only fought him, and you humiliated him, and now he hates you. And honestly, Jon, I wish you hadn't done it. I defended myself. You could have let him win. It would have cost you nothing." Jon stared at her. The gulf between them had never felt wider. He on one side with a sword and a code, she on the other with songs and dreams, and neither able to see the cliff the other was walking toward. "I will never lose on purpose," he said. "Not for a prince. Not for anyone. Barristan taught me that the moment you start losing on purpose, you forget how to win when it matters." Sansa turned and walked away, and Jon let her go, and the distance between them solidified into something cold and permanent that would take a war to thaw. Arya was different. She found Jon in the Red Keep's lower courtyard on his third evening in the capital, while he was running through the six-strike drill with Ghost lying nearby. She sat on the steps and watched with the hungry, focused attention of a girl who had been told her whole life that swords were not for her and had never accepted the verdict. "Teach me," she said. "You have a dancing master, Syrio Forel. Syrio teaches me water dancing. It's fast and light. I want to learn what you do. The real fighting." Jon set his practice sword down and looked at his youngest sister. She was small, dark-haired, grey-eyed. She looked more like him than any of the true-born Stark children, a detail that Catelyn had never forgiven. And she held herself with the coiled energy of a spring compressed and waiting. He taught her, not every day, and not the advanced techniques Barristan had drilled into him over 9 years, but the basics: footwork, balance, the principle of staying centered so that when the world shifted, you could shift with it instead of falling. He taught her in the evenings, when the yard was empty and no one was watching, because a bastard teaching a lord's daughter to fight with a sword was the kind of thing that generated whispers, and King's Landing ran on whispers the way other cities ran on water. Arya learned fast. Not as Jon had learned. She did not have his instinctive feel for distance, his natural rhythm, but with a dogged, relentless persistence that was its own kind of talent. She fell and got up and fell and got up and adjusted and fell again and got up again, and she never once complained, and she never once cried, and Jon loved her for it with a ferocity that surprised him. "You're going to be dangerous," he told her, after a session where she had successfully blocked 3 of his training strikes in a row. "Good," Arya said, and her grey eyes held a light that was equal parts joy and fury. "I want to be dangerous. Nobody listens to girls who aren't dangerous." When the world came apart, when Ned was arrested and the Lannisters seized the Tower of the Hand, Jon's last thought before the fighting started was of Arya, not Sansa. who was already in Cersei's custody and protected by her engagement to Joffrey. Arya, who was small and fierce and carried a sword called Needle, and was somewhere in the Red Keep with no one to protect her. He never found her. In the chaos of the coup, Arya vanished, slipped through the cracks of the Red Keep like water through stone, the way she had always slipped through the cracks of the world that tried to contain her. Jon would not learn for months that she had escaped the city. He would not learn for longer than that where she had gone or what she had become. But he carried her with him, in the tent at night, in the long marches, in the silence between battles, the memory of his little sister blocking strikes in an empty courtyard, her eyes bright, her stance imperfect but willing. She was out there, somewhere, surviving the way he was surviving, with steel and stubbornness and the refusal to be what the world said she should be. He would find her. Someday, when the wars were done and the world had finished trying to tear his family apart, he would find her. That was not a promise he spoke aloud. It was deeper than that, a certainty that lived in his bones, in the same place where Ghost's heartbeat lived, where Barristan's lessons lived, where his father's final gaze from the steps of the Sept of Baelor lived. Some things do not need to be spoken to be binding. Ned Stark had not come south to enjoy the climate. Within a week of his arrival, the new hand was pulling at threads. Jon Arryn's death, the book of lineages the old hand had been studying, the bastard children Robert had sired across the city with their coal-black Baratheon hair. Jon did not grasp all of it, but he grasped enough. His father was hunting a secret, and the secret was dangerous, and the people who kept it were more dangerous still. Jon's role as Barristan's squire gave him access to corners of the Red Keep that most men never saw. He carried messages through the Tower of the Hand. He attended Barristan in the White Sword Tower when the Kingsguard met. He stood behind the old knight's chair at small council meetings and listened to Varys and Littlefinger and Grand Maester Pycelle debate the kingdom's finances, while Ned sat at the head of the table with a face like a man who had swallowed something foul. It was Littlefinger who came for Jon first. He found Jon alone in the Godswood. The Red Keep had one. Small and manicured, and nothing like the wild darkness of Winterfell's, and sat beside him on the bench as though they were old friends. "Jon Snow," Petter Baelish said. His voice was warm, his smile easy, and everything about him set Jon's teeth on edge. The bastard of Winterfell, squiring for the Lord Commander himself. What a remarkable rise. I'm not risen anywhere. I'm a squire. For now. But ambition is a ladder, Jon, and you have the talent to climb higher than any bastard in living memory. All you need is the right friend. Jon studied Littlefinger's face. The man's smile never touched his eyes. It sat on his mouth like a painted mask, and behind it something cold was calculating distances and angles. Sir Barristan says a man who offers friendship unsolicited is usually selling something. Littlefinger's smile widened. Sir Barristan is a wonderful swordsman, but swords are rather blunt instruments for the kind of work that gets done in this city, wouldn't you agree? He left before Jon could answer. That night, Jon told Ned about the conversation. Ned's mouth thinned. Stay away from Baelish. He loved your Aunt Catelyn once, or thought he did, and a man who loves what he cannot have will twist himself into shapes you cannot predict. Father, what are you looking for? In Jon Arryn's records, in the genealogies, what is it? Ned was silent for a long time. Then, a truth that should have stayed buried. But it didn't, and now I have to decide what to do with it. 2 days later, Varys appeared. The eunuch materialized in the corridor outside Jon's chamber like smoke taking human form, round, powdered, his soft hands folded inside his sleeves, his smile as warm as Littlefinger's, and twice as unreadable. He did not sit. He did not stay long. You have your father's eyes, Varys said. Both of your fathers, I think. And then he was gone, and Jon stood in the corridor with the words settling into him like stones dropped into deep water, reaching for a bottom he could not see. The Hands tournament came on a bright morning in the middle of Jon's second month in King's Landing, and it turned the city into a carnival of banners and noise. The lists were set along the Blackwater. Knights from every corner of the realm had come to compete, for the prize money, for the glory, for the chance to be noticed by a king who had once been the greatest warrior in Westeros and now watched from a cushioned seat with a wine cup welded to his hand. The crowd was enormous. The noise was deafening. Jon had never seen anything like it. He wanted to fight. Barristan told him, "No, you're too young, too visible. The queen already hates you. If you ride in this tournament and make her son look like a fool again, which you will, she will find a way to hurt you that I cannot deflect. I'm not afraid of her." "Then you're not paying attention. Fear is not weakness, Jon. Fear is information. It tells you where the danger is. Only fools ignore it." Jon entered the melee anyway. He did not tell Barristan beforehand. He borrowed armor from a sympathetic household knight, strapped on a helm that hid his face, and walked onto the field with a borrowed sword, and the certainty that Barristan would be furious. 40 men entered the melee. Jon dropped the first with a shield check, and the second with the disarming twist Barristan had taught him in the Godswood of Winterfell, 6 years and a lifetime ago. He fought through the press of bodies and steel with a precision that drew shouts from the crowd. Because melee fighters brawled, and this young man moved like water finding the lowest ground, flowing around resistance, striking where the openings lived. He lasted until the final 8, before a hedge knight twice his size caught him with a pommel strike to the helm that rattled his vision loose. Jon went down, and the knight moved on, and when Jon pulled off his helm and stood, Barristan was at the edge of the field with a face like a coming storm. That was reckless. I lasted to the final 8. Against men who've been fighting for 20 years. If that hedge knight had hit you an inch lower, you'd be swallowing your own teeth. "You do not enter a tournament without my leave. Not ever again." Jon nodded. The fury in Barristan's voice was real, but beneath it, Jon heard something else. A fear that had nothing to do with the melee and everything to do with a promise made on the battlements of Winterfell. Under stars, Jon could still see when he closed his eyes. What Jon did not see was who was watching. Cersei had marked the unnamed fighter who moved like her father's worst nightmare. Varys had whispered a name into his silken sleeve. Littlefinger had calculated odds. And across the yard, leaning against a post with his arms folded, Jaime Lannister watched the boy remove his helm and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had seen that fighting style once before. He had seen it on a tourney field at Harrenhal, a lifetime ago, wielded by a man he had loved and admired and envied and murdered a king for. Jaime found Jon that evening. In the White Sword Tower, he leaned in the doorway with his golden hair catching the torchlight and his green eyes holding something Jon could not decipher. "You fight like someone I used to know," Jaime said. Jon stiffened. Barristan had said those words to Ned 9 years ago. Different man, same ghost. "People keep telling me that," Jon said. "Do they?" Jaime's mouth curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Then, maybe you should start asking who." He left without another word. Jon stood in the torchlit room and felt the edges of a secret brush against him, vast and old and heavy, a shape he could almost make out in the dark, like a mountain hidden by fog. He did not ask, not yet. The asking would come later, when the world he stood on had already begun to crack. The capital ran on secrets the way a mill runs on water, constantly, relentlessly, grinding everything it touched into something finer and more dangerous. Jon had been in King's Landing for 2 months, and in that time he had learned to hear the currents beneath the conversation, the way Barristan had taught him to feel the weight shift before a sword stroke. Ned was closing in on the truth about Cersei's children. Jon could see it in the way his father moved through the Red Keep, faster, more purposeful, the distracted courtesy of a man whose mind was 3 rooms ahead of his body. He had visited a blacksmith's apprentice in the Street of Steel, a boy with coal-black hair and Robert's jaw. He had spent hours with the Book of Lineages, tracing the Baratheon line, black of hair, black of hair, black of hair, through every generation, every marriage, every union, until the line met Cersei Lannister and produced 3 golden-haired children, who did not look like their father. Jon did not need the book to understand what that meant. He had eyes. He went to Ned one evening after supper and closed the door and said, "Joffrey isn't Robert's son." Ned looked at him with an expression Jon had never seen on his father's face. Not surprise, not anger, but a weariness so deep it seemed to come from the marrow of his bones. "No," Ned said. "He isn't. None of them are. The Queen and the Kingslayer." Ned did not confirm or deny. He didn't need to. The silence between them was full of things they both already understood. "What will you do?" Jon asked. "Tell Robert. It is his right to know." "And what will Robert do?" Ned stared at the candle on his desk. The flame flickered in a draft neither of them could feel. "What Robert does is Robert's choice. But I will not sit on this, Jon. I will not swallow a lie so the realm stays comfortable. Jon Arryn died for this truth. If I bury it, his death means nothing." Jon wanted to argue. Everything Barristan had taught him about patience, about choosing the right moment, about the difference between courage and recklessness, all of it surged against Ned's iron certainty. But Ned was his father, and Ned was the hand, and Ned had spent a lifetime proving that honor was not just a word he used, but a law he lived under. And Jon did not know how to tell him that the law might kill him. "Be careful," Jon said, and the word felt insufficient, a wooden shield against a steel blade. "I intend to." But Robert left for a hunt the next morning, roaring and laughing, and half drunk before the horses were saddled, and Ned, alone in the Red Keep, with the truth burning a hole through his conscience, made the decision that would destroy him. He went to Cersei. Ned told Cersei to take her children and run. He gave her a chance to flee before Robert returned, because Ned Stark was the kind of man who warned his enemies before he struck them, and because he believed that mercy was not weakness, but the highest expression of strength. Cersei listened. She did not run. Jon learned what Ned had done through Barristan, who had overheard whispers among the Kingsguard. Jaime's face had gone strange during the afternoon watch, and Cersei had been seen in the rookery sending ravens. Barristan pulled Jon aside in the White Sword Tower and told him plainly, "Your father warned the Queen." Jon's stomach dropped. "He what?" He told her what he knows, and he gave her time to leave. "She won't leave, Jon. She'll prepare. We have to get him out. Right now. Before, he won't go. I've spoken to him. He has Robert's letter, a will naming him protector of the realm until Joffrey comes of age. Joffrey isn't Robert's heir. The letter says he is, because Robert doesn't know the truth yet. Your father's plan depends on Robert returning from the hunt. Once Robert is back, Ned presents the evidence, Robert acts, and the Queen falls. Until then, everything holds. Everything held for 4 days. On the 5th day, King Robert Baratheon was carried through the gates of King's Landing on a litter, his belly torn open by a boar's tusk, his face grey. His breathing shallow and wet, with the sound of a man whose lungs were filling with blood. Jon was in the yard when the litter came through. He saw the king's body, the size of it, the ruin of it, and beside him, Barristan stood very still, watching the man he had served for 17 years die by inches on a stretcher. Robert lasted 2 days. In that time, he signed a letter naming Ned Lord Protector. He told Ned he was sorry about Lyanna. He asked for wine. Then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. The king was dead. Everything happened very fast after that. Ned moved within hours of Robert's death. He sent a letter to Stannis Baratheon on Dragonstone, asserting Stannis' claim as the true heir to the Iron Throne. He summoned Littlefinger and asked him to secure the city watch. He called a meeting of the small council and produced Robert's letter naming him Protector. Jon watched his father walk into the throne room that night with 50 Stark household guards and the gold cloaks Littlefinger had promised behind him, and he felt the wrongness before a single sword was drawn. The throne room was too empty. The Lannister guards who should have been at the doors were gone. Cersei sat on the Iron Throne itself, which she had no right to do, and Joffrey stood beside her in a crown that had been made too quickly. The gold was still bright, the gems unevenly set. Ned produced Robert's letter. Cersei took it from the messenger, read it, and tore it in half. "We have a new king," she said. Ned turned to the gold cloaks. "Take the Queen and the Pretender into custody, by order of the Lord Protector." The gold cloaks did not move. Then they moved, but not towards Cersei. They turned on Ned's guards. Steel rang in the throne room. Men died in the first second. 2 Stark guards with gold cloaks, spears through their throats, and then the room became a killing floor. Jon was not in the throne room. He was in the Tower of the Hand, waiting, pacing, unable to stay still. He heard the screaming before the messenger reached him. "Your father is taken," the man gasped, bleeding from a cut across his forehead. Littlefinger betrayed him. The gold cloaks turned. Jon drew his sword and ran. He made it as far as the second courtyard before he met Lannister soldiers, 8 of them, crimson cloaks and lion-headed helms, with orders to secure the Tower of the Hand. Jon fought. Barristan's training poured through him like fire through a chimney. The 6-strike drill, the bind and twist, the lateral footwork that turned an encirclement into a series of one-on-one exchanges. He killed the first man with a thrust under the arm guard. He killed the second with a cut across the throat as the man turned. The third came at him with a spear, and Jon took it out of his hands and put it through his chest. He had never killed before. The act itself was faster than he expected, and the horror was slower, a delayed tide that would reach him later, when there was time for it to break. 2 more guards fell. Jon was fighting the 6th when Barristan arrived at a dead sprint in full armor, white cloaks streaming, and cut through the remaining Lannister men with a speed and brutality that made Jon's own skill look like a child's fumbling. "Where is my father?" Jon demanded. "In custody." "The dungeons." "Jon, listen to me. I'll fight my way down there. There are 200 Lannister guards between you and the Black Cells. You will die in the first corridor, and your father will die in the second, because they'll kill him the moment they hear fighting below. This is not a battle you can win with a sword." Jon's hands shook. His sword dripped blood onto the flagstones. The bodies of the men he had killed lay around him like discarded clothing, and he could feel the horror starting to arrive, distant but coming, a wave still far from shore. "Then, what do I do?" Barristan gripped his arm. His old eyes were fierce and steady, and full of a pain Jon would not understand for years. "You survive. Your father would want you alive. That is the only thing he has ever wanted for you." They went into the depths of the Red Keep, into passages Barristan had learned in 30 years of service, narrow corridors behind the walls, stairs that led nowhere, doors hidden in the stonework that opened into darkness. They moved through the guts of the castle like rats, and behind them the coup continued, and Ned Stark sat in the black of a cell and waited for a justice that would never come. 3 days passed. 3 days of hiding in the bowels of the Red Keep, eating stale bread from a storeroom Barristan had found behind the armory, drinking water from a cistern that tasted of iron and age. 3 days of listening to the castle above them live its new life. Joffrey's life. Cersei's life. A kingdom remaking itself around a lie. On the 3rd morning, Barristan went up. He did not tell Jon what he planned. He left at dawn and returned at midday, and his face was different, lighter in one way, heavier in another, like a man who had set down a burden and picked up a weapon in the same motion. "I've been dismissed," he said. "Dismissed?" "From the Kingsguard. Joffrey, or Cersei through Joffrey, stripped me of my white cloak, told me I was too old to protect the king, offered me a keep and lands in the country." A thin, hard smile crossed his face. "I told them that even now, I could cut through the 5 of them like carving a cake. Then I threw my sword at the foot of the Iron Throne and walked out." Jon stared at him. "And they let you leave?" "They sent men after me. I lost them in the streets." He sat down and unwrapped a loaf of bread he'd stolen from a kitchen. "I'm free, Jon. For the first time in 30 years, I have no oath binding me to a king I despise. We can move. We get my father. Yes, and your sisters. Sansa is in Cersei's custody. Arya. I don't know where Arya is. She may have escaped. There were reports of a girl with a sword fighting in the stables. They planned through the afternoon. Barristan had contacts, servants who owed him favors, a gaoler in the Black Cells, who had once been a man of the watch and still respected the old ways. And there was Varys. The eunuch found them that evening, appearing from a wall as though the stones had birthed him, his round face troubled. "Lord Stark will be taken to the great sept of Baelor on the morrow," Varys said. "He has agreed to confess his treason and take the black." "He'll confess to lies," Jon said. "He will confess to save his daughter. Sansa's life was the price Cersei named, and your father agreed, because your father values his children above his honor, a rare quality in a man." Varys's soft eyes moved between them. "The confession will take place on the steps of the sept, before the crowd. If you mean to intervene, that is when you must do it, in the open, in daylight, where 100,000 witnesses will see what happens." Jon looked at Barristan. "We go to the sept?" "Yes," Varys nodded, his face unreadable. "Then I wish you speed, and I wish you luck, and I wish you the wisdom to know which one matters more." He disappeared back into the wall, and Jon was left to wonder, as he always wondered with Varys, whether the eunuch was helping them out of loyalty or compassion, or some calculus so complex that even the spymaster himself had lost sight of its original shape. The morning came hot and bright, and the crowd gathered on the steps of the great sept like water filling a bowl, slow at first, then faster, then overflowing into the streets beyond. Jon and Barristan stood near the back of the crowd, hooded and cloaked, 2 men among thousands. Jon could see the platform at the top of the steps where the High Septon waited in his crystal crown, and beside him, Joffrey in his gold, and Cersei in her crimson, and the executioner, Sir Ilyn Payne, tongueless and dead-eyed, holding a greatsword Jon recognized. Ice, his father's sword, in the hands of the man who would kill him with it. The doors of the sept opened, and Ned Stark was brought out. He was thinner than Jon remembered, thinner and older, as though the cell had eaten years from him in days. His hair was lank, his clothes were torn. He walked with the careful steps of a man whose body hurt in ways he was trying to hide. But his back was straight, and when he reached the platform and turned to face the crowd, his grey eyes swept across the sea of faces and found, unerringly, the one face he was looking for. Ned's gaze touched Jon's. The distance was vast, 50 yards, 100, more. But Jon felt it like a hand on his shoulder. Ned's expression did not change. He did not nod. He did not smile, but his eyes held his son's for 3 heartbeats, and in those heartbeats, Jon received the only message his father had left to give. "Live," Ned turned to the crowd and confessed. He called himself a traitor. He called Joffrey the true king. Every word was a lie, and every lie was a father buying his daughters' lives with the only currency he had left, his honor, offered up and broken before the gods and men like a sword snapped across a stone. The crowd jeered. They threw rotten fruit. Ned stood and took it, because Ned Stark had never flinched from a hard thing in his life, and this was the hardest thing he had ever done. Joffrey stepped forward. The boy king's face was bright with the raw cruelty of a child who had just discovered that he held a power no one could take away. "My mother bids me let Lord Stark take the black," Joffrey said, "and Lady Sansa has begged mercy for her father." He paused, letting the crowd swell with noise. "But they have the soft hearts of women. So long as I am your king, treason shall never go unpunished. Sir Ilyn, bring me his head." The crowd erupted. Cersei's face went white. Sansa screamed. Jon surged forward. The crowd was too thick, bodies everywhere, pressing, shoving, a wall of flesh between him and the steps. He fought through it, using his elbows, his shoulders, anything. But the crowd was a living thing, and it moved against him, and the distance between him and his father grew instead of shrank. Barristan was behind him, cutting a path. But the path closed as fast as it opened, and the crowd was screaming, and on the platform above, Sir Ilyn Payne raised ice above his head. Jon heard the sound. Not the crowd, not the screaming. The sound of the blade passing through the air, and then a sound he would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. A sound he would never describe, because some sounds exist beyond the reach of language. Barristan caught him. Jon was fighting toward the steps, and Barristan caught him around the waist and dragged him backward, and Jon fought him, punching, clawing, an animal howl tearing out of his throat that didn't sound like any noise he had ever made. And Barristan held him, and kept holding him, absorbing the blows, saying nothing, just holding on until the animal grief spent itself against the iron of the old knight's arms. "He's gone," Barristan said. His voice was cracked. His eyes were wet. "Jon, he's gone." The crowd was surging. Lannister soldiers were pushing through toward the platform. Sansa was screaming on the steps and no one was helping her, and somewhere in the city Arya Stark was running, with a sword called Needle, and no one left to protect her. Barristan dragged Jon into an alley. They pressed against the wall while the crowd flowed past them like a river, and Jon's legs gave out, and he sat on the cobblestones in the shadow of the great sept of Baelor and stared at nothing. His father was dead. The word was too small. Dead. 4 letters. A syllable. It could not contain what had just happened. It could not hold the sound of the blade, or the sight of Ned's eyes finding him in the crowd, or the 3 heartbeats of silence that were the last things his father had ever given him. Barristan crouched beside him. The old knight's hand rested on Jon's shoulder, heavy and warm and alive. "I made your father a promise," Barristan said. "On the walls of Winterfell, under the stars, I promised him I would bring you home alive. I intend to keep that promise, Jon, but I cannot do it if you don't stand up." Jon looked at him. His eyes were dry. The tears would come later, much later, in a tent in the Riverlands, in the dark, where no one could see them. For now there was only a vast, ringing emptiness where his father's voice used to live. He stood. They moved through the alleys and side streets, 2 hooded figures among the chaos, heading for the Gate of the Gods. Barristan had horses waiting, arranged by Varys, or by a contact he did not name, and by midday they were on the road north, riding hard, leaving King's Landing behind them like a bad dream that would not stop following. Jon did not look back. There was nothing behind him now. His father was dead. His sisters were lost. His home was 1,000 leagues away, and the world between here and there was full of men who wanted him captured or killed. He rode north. Barristan rode beside him. The old knight and the bastard boy, fugitives both, with nothing between them and the war but a pair of borrowed horses and a grief so heavy it bent the light. They rode north for 12 days, through rain and heat and the long amber evenings of a summer that did not know it was ending. Barristan kept them off the King's Road, following cart tracks and game trails through the countryside, stopping at villages where no one asked questions, and inns where the innkeeper could be persuaded, with coin or silence, to forget 2 travelers who ate their food and slept in the stable and left before dawn. Jon did not speak for the first 3 days. He rode. He ate when Barristan set food in front of him. He slept when Barristan told him to sleep. But his eyes were wrong. Flat, unfocused, turned inward toward a place where a blade fell endlessly, and the sound never stopped echoing. On the 4th morning, Barristan woke to find Jon sitting by the dead fire with his sword in his lap, grinding the edge against a stone with a slow, rhythmic intensity that was less maintenance than ritual. "I'm going to kill Joffrey," Jon said. His voice was calm. His hands were steady. He might have been discussing the weather. Barristan sat down across from him. The morning was grey, the trees dripping from an overnight rain. Their horses stood tied to a stunted oak, watching with the mild boredom of animals who did not understand what humans did or why. "You could try," Barristan said. "You might even succeed. You're good enough to fight your way into the Red Keep, and good enough to reach the throne room, and perhaps good enough to kill the boy before his guards kill you. And then what? Then he's dead. And so are you, and your brother Robb loses his finest sword before the war even begins. And your sisters, if Arya is alive, if Sansa can be rescued, lose the one person willing to fight for them. And your father's death means nothing, because the son he died protecting threw his life away on vengeance." Jon's hands stopped moving on the stone. The sword gleamed in the grey light, its edge bright and cruel and ready. "I served a mad king," Barristan said. "Rhaegar Targaryen. He burned men alive and laughed while they screamed. I stood outside the door while he did things to his queen that no man should hear. I could have killed him. Every day, I could have put a sword through his throat and ended it. Do you know why I didn't? Because of your oath. Because killing him would not have undone what he had done. It would not have brought back the men he'd burned or healed the queen he'd brutalized. It would have given me a moment of satisfaction, and then it would have made me a kinslayer in spirit, if not in blood. A man who murdered the thing he was sworn to protect. Vengeance is not justice, Jon. Vengeance is a fire that eats the man who lights it. Then, what is justice? Justice is making sure it never happens again. Justice is building something so strong that no Joffrey, no Cersei, no Littlefinger can tear it down. Your brother is gathering an army. Go to him. Stand beside him. Fight the war your father died for. That is justice. Jon stared at the sword in his lap for a long time. Then he sheathed it and stood and went to saddle his horse. He did not mention Joffrey again for weeks. The fury had not left him. It would never leave him entirely. But it had been folded inward, pressed and hardened, turned from a wildfire into something that could be directed and aimed and controlled. They crossed the Trident again, going the other way this time, and Jon did not look at the ford where Rhaegar's rubies lay in the mud. They rode into the riverlands, where the fields were burning and the small folk were fleeing, and the war had already begun to eat the land alive. And on the 13th day they came over a ridge and saw the Stark banners, the grey direwolf on white, flying above a camp that spread across the river valley, like a city made of canvas and steel. Robb's army. 20,000 men, maybe more. The largest northern host in a generation. Jon rode down the hill toward his brother, and for the first time since the Sept of Baelor, something inside him that had been clenched like a fist began, very slowly, to open. Robb met them in the command tent. He had changed. The boy Jon had sparred with in Winterfell's yard was gone, replaced by a young man who wore command the way some men wore armor, not always comfortably, but without apology. His auburn hair was longer. His jaw was harder. Grey wind lay at his feet, a direwolf the size of a pony, yellow eyes tracking every movement in the tent. When Jon came through the entrance, Robb stared at him for 3 heartbeats. Then he crossed the tent in 4 strides and wrapped his arms around his brother. And grey wind rose and pressed his massive head against Jon's thigh, and the northern lords who had been watching from their chairs looked away from the reunion, with the studied discomfort of hard men confronted by emotion. "I heard about father," Robb said. His voice was thick. "I heard and I couldn't. I was already marching. I couldn't stop the march to—" "You couldn't have stopped it," Jon said. "No one could." They held each other for another moment. Then Robb stepped back and became the commander again, his face settling into the mask that kings learn to wear before they learn to breathe. "And Sir Barristan," Robb turned to the old knight, who stood just inside the tent, with his white cloak folded over his arm, like a flag he no longer knew where to plant. "My lords will have questions about your loyalties." "As they should," Barristan said. "I served the Mad King. I served the usurper who replaced him. I served the Boy King who murdered your father. My record is not one that inspires trust." From the back of the tent, the great Jon Umber stood. He was the largest man Jon had ever seen, and his voice filled the tent the way thunder fills a valley. "Why should we trust a Kingsguard knight? You've bent the knee to every king who sat the Iron Throne, and 2 of them were monsters. What makes this one different?" "Because this time I chose," Barristan said. "Every king before this I served because of an oath I swore as a young man who did not understand what the oath would cost. I did not choose Aerys. I did not choose Robert. I did not choose Joffrey. But I choose to stand here, in this tent, and offer my sword to the brother of the boy I trained and the son of the man I failed to save. That is not duty. That is something older and heavier." The Greyjon stared at him. Then he grunted and sat down, which was as close to approval as the Greyjon ever came. Robb looked at Jon. "I need you. Both of you. Sir Barristan, you know how Tywin Lannister fights. You know how Jaime fights. You know the Kingsguard, the gold cloaks, the defenses of King's Landing. That knowledge is worth more than 1,000 swords. And me? Jon asked. You're my brother. You're the best fighter in this army. And you're the only person in this tent who'll tell me when I'm wrong. Robb smiled, a smile that was half grief, half iron. The smile of a boy who had become a king at 16 and already understood what it would cost. I'm naming you commander of my personal guard and champion of the North. If anyone has objections, they can take them up with Grey Wind. No one objected. That night, Jon walked through the camp and listened to the sounds of 20,000 men preparing for war. The ring of hammers on steel, the laughter around cookfires, the low murmur of prayers to gods old and new. And he felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like a second cloak, heavier than any armor. These men were going to die for his brother. Some of them would die tomorrow. And Jon, trained by the finest knight in the realm, carrying a grief that had turned to steel inside his chest, was going to lead them into battle and bring as many home as a man could. He found Barristan at the edge of the camp, looking south. Are we ready? Jon asked. No army is ever ready, Barristan said, but this one has something most armies don't. What? A cause worth fighting for, and a king who hasn't forgotten why he's fighting. That matters more than numbers. I've seen it save armies that should have died and doom armies that should have won. The first time Jon led men into battle on his own, he learned something Barristan had never told him. It happened 3 weeks after he and Barristan reached Robb's camp, during a raid on a Lannister supply column moving through the hills south of Riverrun. Robb sent Jon with 80 men, cavalry, fast and light, to intercept the wagons before they reached Tywin's main force. It was the kind of mission Jon had trained for. Quick, decisive, built on surprise and speed. The attack went perfectly. The Lannister guards were outnumbered and caught in a narrow valley with no room to form lines. Jon led the charge himself, sweeping down the hillside with Ghost running at his stirrup and his sword catching the afternoon light, and the enemy broke before the northern riders were halfway across the valley floor. The wagons were taken. The supplies, grain, arrow shafts, horseshoes, salt meat, were seized or burned. The Lannister guards who survived surrendered, and Jon accepted their surrender with the formal courtesy Barristan had taught him, because a man who takes prisoners with grace earns something that a man who slaughters them never will. But 7 of Jon's men died. He found the first body after the fighting was over, a young northerner from the Cerwyn levies, no older than Jon himself, lying on his back in the grass with a Lannister spear through his stomach and his eyes open, and his mouth frozen in an expression that was not pain but surprise, as though death had arrived at the wrong address and the boy was waiting for it to realize its mistake and move on. Jon stood over him and felt nothing. That was the lesson, not the killing. He had killed in King's Landing, and the fighting at the Twins had hardened him further. The lesson was the numbness, the absence of feeling where feeling should have been. 7 men dead under his command, and he could not locate the grief, could not find the guilt, could not summon anything at all except a cold. Administrative awareness that 7 was a number and the mission was complete, and the column would need replacements before the next engagement. He went to Barristan that night, shaking. Something is wrong with me. The old knight was cleaning his armor by the fire, running an oiled cloth along the links of his mail with the steady, rhythmic motions of a man performing a task he had performed 10,000 times. He did not look up. You commanded men today. Some of them died. You completed the mission. And now you feel nothing, and the nothingness frightens you more than the battle did. Yes, Barristan set the cloth down. His eyes found Jon's, and in the firelight they were old and knowing and full of a compassion that Jon had never seen the knight direct at himself. I was 16 the first time I led a charge, the battle at Blackhaven during the Stepstones War. I lost 11 men and killed 3 of the enemy myself, and afterward I walked through the field and counted the dead and felt exactly what you feel now. Nothing, a perfect, terrible emptiness, as though someone had scooped the contents of my chest out with a spoon and left the shell behind. Does it come back? The feeling? It comes back. Not all at once, in pieces, over days and weeks. The grief arrives first, usually at night, when you're trying to sleep. Then the guilt. Then, if you're fortunate, the understanding. Understanding of what? That the numbness is not cruelty. It is your mind protecting itself from a weight it cannot carry while you're still in danger. The body knows what the heart does not, that if you feel everything in the moment, you will shatter, and shattered men cannot protect the living. Barristan picked up the cloth and resumed cleaning. You will grieve for those 7 men, Jon. Not tonight, perhaps not this week. But the grief will find you, and when it does, you will carry it. Because that is what command means. It means carrying the dead on your shoulders and walking forward anyway. Jon sat by the fire and watched the sparks rise into the dark. Ghost pressed against his leg, warm and solid and alive. Somewhere in the camp, a soldier was singing a song about a girl he'd left behind, and the melody was sweet and sad and ordinary, and Jon felt the first crack in the numbness, a thin fissure, barely perceptible, through which something warm and painful began to seep. He did not sleep that night. He sat and watched the fire burn down to embers and then to ash, and in the morning he rose and washed his face and put on his armor and went to the command tent. And Robb looked at him and saw something new in his brother's eyes. Not hardness, not coldness, but a depth that had not been there before. The depth of a man who has seen the price of leadership written in 7 bodies on a hillside and has decided to pay it anyway. Barristan watched from the corner of the tent, and on his face was the expression Jon would come to recognize as the old knight's version of pride. Not a smile, not a nod, but a slight relaxation of the muscles around his eyes, a softening so subtle that only someone who had spent 9 years studying his face would notice it at all. The trap was Robb's design. Barristan refined it. The original plan called for a feint at the Lannister lines near the Green Fork, while Robb's main force swung west to catch Jaime's army besieging Riverrun. It was a sound plan, bold, fast, built on the assumption that the Lannisters would not expect a 16-year-old to split his forces. Barristan studied the maps for a full day and made 3 changes. He moved the crossing point 2 leagues south, where the river bent and the forest grew thick to the waterline, giving the northern cavalry a concealed approach that cut 3 hours from the march. He suggested that the outriders ride with muffled hooves and no torches, arriving at the Whispering Wood in the deepest part of the night, and he told Robb where Jaime would be. Jaime fights at the front, Barristan said. Always, he can't help himself. When the trap springs, he'll charge the thickest fighting, because he believes he's invincible. He's nearly right, but nearly is a gap wide enough to drive a spear through. The battle happened in the dark, in the trees, in the mud and chaos of a forest that earned its name from how the wind moved through the leaves like whispered warnings that came too late. Jon fought beside Robb. They had trained together for years under Barristan's eye, and in battle they moved as a single instrument, Robb leading the charge, Jon covering his flank, each anticipating the other's movements with the seamless coordination of brothers who had bled together since childhood. Jaime Lannister came through the trees like a golden storm. He was everything the stories promised, fast, brutal, impossibly skilled, cutting through the northern soldiers with a grace that made murder look like art. His white cloak was soaked with blood. His sword moved in arcs that seemed to bend the firelight around them. 3 men tried to stop him. 3 men died. Jon met him in a clearing, between 2 burning trees. The fight lasted less than a minute, but Jon would remember every second of it for the rest of his life. Jaime attacked with a combination that should have ended the bout in 2 strokes, a feint high, a cut low, a thrust that came from an angle Jon had never seen. Jon blocked the first, dodged the second, and caught the third on his crossguard with a ring of steel that echoed through the burning wood. Jaime's eyes widened. Men did not block that combination. It was the move that had made his reputation. 3 strokes, faster than thought, lethal as lightning. Jon countered with the 6-strike drill. 1, 2, 3, 4. Jaime parried them all. But he was moving backward now, giving ground, and the 5th stroke, the reverse cut, the one Jon had learnt in the snow at 8 years old, grazed Jaime's arm guard and bit into the leather beneath. Then Robb's men closed in, and Jaime was overwhelmed, not by Jon alone, but by the weight of numbers and the traps snapping shut around him. He went down fighting. It took 6 men to disarm him and bring him to his knees in the mud. The Kingslayer, chained and bleeding, was dragged before Robb Stark. Jon stood behind his brother and watched Jaime look up at the young king with an expression that mixed fury and grudging respect and something else. A weariness that ran deeper than the battle, as though losing had torn away a mask he had been wearing for years. It was Barristan who came forward. The old knight stood before his former brother in the Kingsguard, and the 2 men regarded each other across a gulf that held 20 years of shared duty and unshared choices. "You broke your oath," Barristan said. "Which one?" Jaime's voice was hoarse, his smile thin and cutting even in chains. "I've broken so many I've lost count. At least I only killed 1 king." "How many have you watched die, old man?" Barristan did not flinch, enough to know the difference between a knight who fails and a knight who stops trying. He turned to Robb. "Keep him alive, your grace. A dead Kingslayer is a trophy. A living one is leverage." Robb nodded. Jaime was taken away, and the whispering wood went silent, and the night smelled of blood and pine sap, and the distant smoke of a war that had only just begun. They won the second battle at the camps below Riverrun, scattering the Lannister besiegers and lifting the siege in a single night. Robb's uncle Edmure Tully opened the castle gates and wept. The Riverlords rallied. For the first time since the war began, the Stark-Tully alliance held the initiative, and the South was on its heels. But war does not end with victories, it only changes shape. The lords gathered in the Great Hall of Riverrun, Northern Lords and Riverlords, men who had fought together and bled together and now sat across from each other at a table too small for their combined ambitions. Robb sat at the head, with Jon at his right and Catelyn at his left, and Barristan stood behind them like a shadow in white wool. The Gratian was the first to speak. He stood and drew his sword and drove it into the table so hard the wood split. "The Iron Throne means nothing to me. Joffrey is no king of mine. Renly is not my king. Stannis is not my king. There sits the only king I mean to bend my knee to." He turned to Robb. "The king in the north." The hall erupted. Every lord rose, every sword came out, and the shout rolled through the castle like a wave. "King in the north! King in the north!" And Robb sat in his chair and let it wash over him, and Jon watched his brother's face and saw the weight settle onto it like a crown made of stone. Later, when the hall was empty and the torches burned low, Robb sat alone at the table with the Great Jon's sword still embedded in the wood. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "Kings rarely do," Barristan said from the doorway. "The ones who ask for it are usually the ones who shouldn't have it." Jon sat beside his brother. "What do you need?" "I need father. I need him to walk through that door and tell me what to do." Robb's voice was barely a whisper. He was 16 years old, and the weight of a kingdom sat on his shoulders, and in the firelight, he looked like a boy playing dress up in a dead man's armor. "He can't come through that door," Jon said. "But he taught us both. And what he taught us? Honor. Duty. The things that matter when everything else burns. Those things are in this room. They're in you." Robb looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, and the boy disappeared, and the king straightened in his chair. "Stannis Baratheon will declare for the Iron Throne," Robb said. "Renly already has. Balon Greyjoy is probably sharpening his axe as we speak. And Tywin Lannister is regrouping. The North is free, but freedom is only the first problem. Holding it is the second." He turned to Barristan. "What would you do, Sir Barristan, if you were in my place?" "I would remember that wars are won by the side that makes the fewest mistakes, not by the side that wins the most battles." The old knight moved to the table and sat, lowering himself onto the bench with the care of a man whose bones had been carrying armor for longer than Robb had been alive. "Tywin will come for you. Not in rage. Tywin Lannister does not do rage. He will come with patience and gold and the slow, grinding pressure of a man who has been winning wars since before your father was born. You cannot outfight him. You must outthink him. Robb listened, and for the first time, the war began to feel like something that might be survived. The alliance with Walder Frey had been struck on the march south, before the Whispering Wood, before everything. Robb needed to cross the Twins to reach the Lannister armies, and old Walder Frey, 90 years old, bitter as bad wine, nursing grudges older than most of his children, demanded a price. Robb would marry one of his daughters. Robb had agreed. A king's word, given under the eyes of gods and witnessed by lords, binding as iron. Barristan had not been present for the oath, but when Robb told him, the old knight's face went still in a way Jon had come to recognize. The stillness of a man who sees a danger that has not yet arrived, but is already walking toward them. "You understand what you've promised," Barristan said. It was not a question. "I do." "Then you must keep it. An oath from a king is not a suggestion. It is the foundation of his authority. If you break it, you tell every lord in this alliance that your word is conditional, that it applies only when it's convenient. And the first lord who decides that your word means nothing will act accordingly." Robb heard the warning. He absorbed it. He filed it in the place where kings keep the promises they intend to honor. The war continued. Robb won battles. The Northern army swept through the Riverlands, breaking Lannister supply lines, raiding Tywin's baggage trains, freeing castles that had fallen to Lannister occupation. Jon led the vanguard in 3 separate engagements, and in each one he fought with the deadly precision Barristan had spent 9 years building. A swordsmanship that combined northern ferocity with southern technique, raw power channeled through disciplined form. The Riverlords told stories about him. The Bastard of Winterfell, they called him. The Bold's apprentice. The Sword of the North. Jon heard the names and dismissed them and kept fighting, because the names were decoration and the fighting was real, and between the two he had learned to focus on what mattered. But the war was not a sword fight. It was a siege, long, grinding, full of mud and waiting, and the slow erosion of hope. The Northern army could win every battle and still lose the war. Because Tywin Lannister did not need to win battles. He needed to survive them. His gold bought mercenaries. His name bought alliances. His patience bought time. And time was the one weapon Robb could not counter, because every day the army sat in the Riverlands was a day the North went ungoverned, and the lords who had left their castles to fight grew restless for home. Catelyn arrived from Renly's camp with bad news. Renly was dead, murdered by Shadow, the stories said, though no one could agree on the details, and Stannis had claimed his brother's army and was marching on King's Landing. The game was shifting. The board was changing. And Robb, 16 years old and crowned too young, was running out of moves. "We need allies," Robb said in the War Council, his voice tight with the frustration of a young man who had mastered tactics but was still learning strategy. "Allies cost," Barristan said, "and the price goes up every day you don't win." The war dragged into its second year, and the shape of it changed. Stannis Baratheon smashed the Lannister fleet at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, and very nearly took King's Landing before Tywin arrived with the Tyrells at his back and drove him from the walls. The Battle of the Blackwater, which Jon heard about through ravens and refugees and the garbled, contradictory accounts of travellers, was a catastrophe for Stannis, and a reprieve for the Lannisters. And it altered the calculus of the war in ways that made Barristan sit at the map table for hours, moving wooden markers across painted landscapes, with the slow, methodical patience of a man solving a problem that refused to stay solved. "Tywin has the Tyrells now," Barristan said, late one night when the tent was empty except for him and Jon. "The largest army in Westeros, married to the Lannister gold and the Lannister name. Stannis is broken, his fleet is ash, his army is scattered, and we hold the North and the Riverlands. But we cannot march south without leaving the North undefended, and we cannot stay here without bleeding out man by man, battle by battle, until there is nothing left to defend. Is there a way to win? There is always a way. It is rarely the way you want." Barristan moved a marker on the map, the Stark direwolf, positioned in the Riverlands. "Your brother needs to think about what winning means." Not the Iron Throne, he has no interest in that, and even if he did, he cannot take it. Not the death of Tywin Lannister, that would solve nothing, because the Lannister machine runs without its master. Winning, for the king in the north, means securing a peace that protects his kingdom. An independent north, recognized by whatever king sits the Iron Throne, with borders no one will cross. Tywin will never agree to that. Not today. But wars do not end because one side defeats the other. They end because both sides grow tired enough to negotiate. And Tywin Lannister, for all his brilliance, is an old man fighting a young man's war. He will tire. The question is whether your brother can outlast him without making a mistake that gives Tywin the opening he needs. Jon stared at the map. The wooden markers represented armies, but what they really represented was men. Thousands of men, each one with a name and a face and a family, each one a life balanced on the decisions of kings and lords who would never meet them. The responsibility of it pressed against Jon's chest like a hand pushing him underwater. Robb made a mistake, Jon said. The admission cost him. Marrying Jane, the Karstarks. He's made mistakes. Every king makes mistakes. The question is not whether you err, but whether you survive the error. Robert made 1,000 mistakes and died fat and happy, because none of them caught up to him before the boar did. Aerys made one mistake. He forgot that the man standing behind him with a sword had a conscience, and it killed him. Your brother is somewhere between those two extremes. His mistakes are not fatal, not yet. But they are accumulating, and somewhere in the south, Tywin Lannister is counting them. Ghost raised his head from his paws and looked toward the tent entrance. A moment later, a runner appeared, a young soldier, breathless from sprinting across the camp. "My lord," the boy said, "a raven from the twins. Lord Frey invites his grace to a wedding." Jon and Barristan looked at each other across the map table. The wooden markers sat between them, wolves and lions and towers and roses, and the game that had been playing out across the continent for 2 years narrowed suddenly to a single point, a single castle, a single invitation that smelled of bread and salt and something darker beneath. "It begins," Barristan said. The raven arrived on a morning when the rain had not stopped for a week and the camp smelled of wet canvas and despair. Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell. Jon read the letter twice. The message was short, and the meaning was monstrous. Theon, who had grown up in Winterfell, who had eaten at their table and trained in their yard and called Robb his brother in everything but blood, had sailed to the Iron Islands, pledged himself to his father's cause, and sailed back to take the castle that had raised him. Bran and Rickon were dead, killed and hung from the walls for the castle to see. 2 boys, 7 and 3, displayed like hunting trophies by a man who had once played at swords with their brothers in the same yard where their bodies now hung. Jon set the letter down. His face was very still. Robb threw a chair across the tent. Grey wind howled. The northern lords erupted in fury, demanding blood, demanding vengeance, demanding the army wheel north and take back what was theirs. The War Council became a shouting match that lasted an hour and resolved nothing. When the tent was empty except for Jon, Robb and Barristan, the old knight spoke. "Grief makes poor strategy," Barristan said. "I've watched armies destroy themselves by reacting to pain instead of thinking through it. Winterfell is stone. It has stood for 8,000 years, and it will stand after Theon Greyjoy is dust. If your brothers are gone, and I grieve for them, truly, no amount of haste will bring them back. But if you abandon this war to chase Theon, Tywin Lannister will close the trap behind you, and the North will lose its army along with its home." "I trained with him," Jon said. His voice was low, each word carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. "He stood beside me in that yard. Barristan corrected his grip once, and Theon couldn't look at him for a week because a Kingsguard knight had noticed his footwork was wrong. And now he's killed 2 children. People are not who they are in the practice yard," Barristan said. "They are who they are when the world offers them power and no one is watching. Theon wanted to be someone. He chose the worst possible way to become it." Catelyn sat in the corner, her face carved from white stone. She had not spoken since the letter arrived. Her sons, her youngest sons, her babies, were dead. And the grief had hollowed her out so completely that words could find no purchase inside her. The army did not ride north. Robb sent Bolton's bastard to retake Winterfell instead, a decision that would have consequences he could not yet see, and the northern host stayed in the Riverlands, and the war continued, and the dead boys haunted every meal and every silence and every moment of laughter that arrived unbidden and was strangled before it could fully form. Then, the Karstarks broke. Lord Rickard Karstark's 2 eldest sons had died in the Whispering Wood, killed by Jaime Lannister himself, during the Kingslayer's furious charge toward Robb. Karstark had mourned them in the way of Northerners, silently, deeply, with a rage that did not diminish but only compressed, growing denser with each passing day. When Catelyn, in a moment of desperate grief over her own lost children, released Jaime Lannister and sent him south with Brienne of Tarth in exchange for a promise of Sansa's return, Karstark's rage found its target. He took matters into his own hands and murdered 2 Lannister prisoners, squires, barely more than boys. Robb executed him for it, took his head in the godswood of Riverrun, in the rain, with the weirwood watching. Justice, Robb called it. Law, the same principle Ned Stark had lived by and died by, the iron code that bent for no man. The Karstark forces, nearly half of Robb's remaining infantry, packed their tents and marched north the same day. Barristan watched them go and said nothing to Robb. Later, in the privacy of Jon's tent, he said something to Jon. Your brother did what his father would have done. He applied the law without compromise, and the law cost him half his army. What else could he have done? Imprisoned Karstark, stripped his titles, held his sons hostage against his behavior. 100 things short of execution that would have kept the Karstark swords in the fight. That's not justice. No, it's survival. And survival, Jon, is the soil that justice grows in. Without it, justice is just a word spoken by a dead man. Barristan's face was heavy with years and wars and the memory of better men than himself who had died for principles that their enemies had outlived. I served Aerys, who used justice as a weapon. I served Robert, who ignored justice entirely. Neither approach worked. The truth is somewhere in the space between, a place where mercy and strength coexist, where a king can punish without destroying, where the law bends just enough to keep from breaking. Jon heard the lesson. He was not sure he agreed with it, but he heard it, and he carried it. And in the weeks that followed, as the army shrank and the war turned harder, and Robb's face grew thinner and older with each passing day, Jon returned to those words again and again, turning them over like a coin he was not yet sure how to spend. The girl came into Robb's life at the worst possible moment, which is how love always arrives in wartime, not as a gift, but as a complication, not as a salve, but as a wound that opens where the armor was already thinnest. Her name was Jane Westerling. She was the daughter of a minor Lannister bannerman, lord of a castle so insignificant that Barristan had to think for a full minute before he could recall its name. Robb had taken the crag during a raid, a small victory, barely worth reporting, and had taken an arrow in the arm during the assault. Jane tended the wound. She was young, pretty, gentle in the way that southern girls were gentle, with soft hands and dark eyes and a tenderness that must have felt. To a boy who had been drowning in blood and duty for months, like a rope thrown to a man going under, Robb bedded her. And then, because he was Ned Stark's son, and Ned Stark's sons did not dishonor women, he married her. Jon heard the news from a scout who rode into camp at dawn with a grin on his face and congratulations on his lips. And Jon's first reaction was not anger, but a strange, hollow dread. The feeling of watching a bridge collapse in slow motion, knowing what lay on the other side, and knowing there was nothing he could do to stop the fall. He found Robb in the command tent. The young king was dressed in his camp clothes, his auburn hair uncombed, his face carrying the unmistakable glow of a man who has spent the night doing something wonderful and has not yet reckoned with what it will cost. Before you say anything, Robb began. You gave the Freys your word. I know what I gave them. Your word, Robb, a king's oath, witnessed by lords, sworn before gods. And you broke it because a girl bandaged your arm and you couldn't keep your breeches tied. The glow left Robb's face. It was replaced by something harder, the stubbornness that ran through the Stark line like iron through rock, the same unyielding pride that had made Ned confront Cersei when any sane man would have fled. I married her because it was right. I took her to bed, and I owed her my name. Father would have done the same. Father kept his promises. That's the difference. They stared at each other across the table. Maps lay between them, rivers, roads, troop positions, the geography of a war that was suddenly teetering on a fulcrum neither of them controlled. Grey Wind lay in the corner, watching with amber eyes that tracked the tension between the two brothers the way a wolf tracks a wounded deer. You don't understand, Robb said, and his voice cracked, just slightly, along a line that ran between the boy he had been and the king he was trying to become. You don't know what it's like. Watching men die every day, carrying every death, and then finding someone who makes you feel like something other than a weapon, someone who touches you and doesn't want anything except to touch you. You don't know. Jon stood very still. He wanted to say that he did know, that he carried the same loneliness, the same weight, the same desperate hunger for something warm in a world made of iron and blood. That he had not sought it out because Barristan had taught him to put duty above desire, and because he had watched what happened when men did the opposite. Instead, he said, I know what the Freys will do. They'll be angry. I'll make amends. You can't make amends for this. You took their honor and their daughters and threw both in the river. Walder Frey has been waiting 90 years for someone to treat him with respect, and you just told him his family isn't worth the breath it took to promise them. Robb's jaw set. The argument was over. Jon had neither won nor lost, but Robb had stopped listening, as young men in love always stop listening when the world tries to explain the price of what they have chosen. Jon left the tent. Barristan was waiting outside, sitting on a camp stool with a cup of water and a face that said he had heard every word through the canvas. He won't hear it, Barristan said. No, then we protect him from the consequences. The old knight set his cup down and looked at Jon with eyes that had watched 3 kings rise and 2 kings fall and understood, better than anyone alive, the precise width of the gap between a crown and a grave. Your brother has made an enemy of the one man in Westeros who never forgets a slight. We cannot undo that. But we can be ready for what comes next. What comes next? I don't know yet. But I've been watching Roose Bolton, and I've been thinking about Walder Frey, and there is a shape forming in the darkness that I do not like. Barristan had spent 30 years in the Red Keep, surrounded by men whose smiles concealed intentions that could end a dynasty. He had watched Aerys descend into madness while the court pretended everything was fine. He had watched Robert drink himself to death while Cersei sharpened the knife behind his back. He had learned to read the difference between loyalty and performance, the subtle tells that distinguished a man who served from a man who waited. Roose Bolton was waiting. The Lord of the Dreadfort was a thin, pale man with colourless eyes and a voice so soft it forced everyone around him to lean in, which gave him the advantage of watching their faces from inches away. He attended every war council. He followed every order. He said nothing that could be questioned and did nothing that could be challenged. And that, in Barristan's experience, was the most dangerous kind of man, the one who obeyed so perfectly that no one noticed when obedience became strategy. Barristan started watching. Not obviously, he was too old and too practiced for that, but with the steady, patient observation of a man who had guarded kings against threats they could not see. He noticed the ravens first. Bolton sent more ravens than any other lord in the camp, more than could be accounted for by reports to the Dreadfort. The maester Bolton travelled with was a quiet man who avoided the other maesters, and the ravens he sent flew south, not north. He noticed the meetings. Bolton spoke with Walder Frey's representatives, minor Frey cousins who came and went from the camp on pretexts that involved provisions and supply lines, longer than provisioning required, and always in his private tent. with guards posted who answered to Bolton alone. He noticed the silences. When the War Council discussed strategy, Bolton listened but did not contribute. When Robb made decisions Bolton disagreed with, Bolton nodded and said nothing. When the Karstark executions gutted the army, Bolton's face showed neither disapproval nor satisfaction. Only that pale, empty watchfulness, like a cat sitting beside a mousehole with infinite patience and no need to rush. On the 14th day of watching, Barristan told Jon. They walked the perimeter of the camp in the hour before dawn, when the sentries were tired, and the conversations of men around dying fires carried farther than they should. Bolton is corresponding with someone south of here, Barristan said. My guess is Tywin Lannister. The ravens fly wrong for the Dreadfort. Jon's stride did not break. Barristan had trained him well enough that bad news did not interrupt his gait. You're sure? I've spent a lifetime reading the posture of men who intend betrayal. Bolton holds himself the way Jaime held himself in the weeks before the sack of King's Landing. Present, obedient, already gone. And the Freys have been sending men into camp with supply carts that are suspiciously well guarded for wagons full of turnips. What do you think they're planning? I think Walder Frey is going to invite your brother to the twins. A wedding, perhaps. Robb will need to make amends for breaking his oath, and the Freys will offer a second chance. A different match. Edmure Tully for a Frey girl, maybe. Something that lets Robb apologize without losing too much face. And at the wedding? At the wedding, in the one place where guest right should protect him, they will kill him. Every lord, every guard, every man who bears the Stark name, Bolton will stand aside or join in. And by morning the Northern Army will be leaderless, and the Freys will hold every bridge between the north and the Riverlands. Jon stopped walking. The eastern sky was turning grey, and the camp was beginning to stir. The first fires being lit, the first sentries being relieved, the ordinary sounds of an army waking to another day of war. Tell Robb. I have no proof. Bolton is too clever to leave proof. The ravens are circumstantial. The meetings are deniable. If I go to Robb with suspicions and nothing else, Bolton will deny everything, and I'll look like a paranoid old man who sees treachery in every shadow. Then what do? We go to the twins. When the invitation comes, and it will come, we accept it. But we go prepared. Hidden weapons. Trusted men positioned at every exit. A contingency for every scenario I can imagine, and 3 I probably can't. Jon looked at Barristan. The old knight's face was calm, still, and sharp, and designed for a single purpose. How many times have you done this? Jon asked. Survived a betrayal? Barristan considered. 3 times. Duskendale, the Defiance, the sack. Each time I lived because I saw it coming and moved before the trap was set. Your brother is too young to see it, and too trusting, his father's son in the worst possible way. So we will see it for him. The invitation arrived 6 days later. Walder Frey offered Edmure Tully a bride, Roslyn Frey, his prettiest daughter, as a gesture of reconciliation. The wedding would be held at the twins. Guest right would be observed. All was forgiven. Robb read the letter with relief written across his face, and Jon watched the relief with a dread that sat in his stomach like a stone. They arrived at the twins on a grey afternoon, the army strung out along the road in a column that stretched for 2 leagues. The castle sat astride the Green Fork like a troll guarding a bridge. 2 squat towers connected by a stone causeway, with murder holes above and the river running cold and dark below. Walder Frey's banners hung from every parapet. The gates stood open. Bread and salt were brought to the yard. Guest right. Sacred. Inviolable. Protected by gods and men, and the oldest custom in the realm. Jon ate the bread and tasted the salt and felt nothing but the weight of the knife strapped against his back, beneath his doublet, where no one would think to search. Barristan had prepared them over the previous week. 30 men, hand-picked, the most lethal fighters in the Northern Army, wore hidden blades beneath their feast clothes. Jon had mapped every exit from the Great Hall. Barristan had identified the galleries above the hall where crossbowmen could be concealed, and he had positioned 4 of his men in the corridors leading to those galleries with instructions to move at the first sign of trouble. Grey Wind was the problem. The Freys demanded the direwolf be kennelled. Robb agreed, over Jon's objection. Jon posted 2 of his best men at the kennel, with orders to release the wolf the instant they heard fighting. The feast began at sunset. The great hall of the twins was hung with Frey banners, 2 grey towers on blue, and the tables were laden with food, and the wine flowed fast, and the music played loud enough to cover the sound of doors closing. Jon noticed the doors. He noticed the musicians in the gallery changing instruments. Not lyres and drums now, but something heavier, and their hands were wrong, calloused in ways that musicians' hands were not. He caught Barristan's eye across the hall. The old knight gave the barest nod. The wedding ceremony was brief. Edmure married Roslyn Frey, who was indeed pretty, and who wept through the vows in a way that could have been joy but looked, to Jon's trained eyes, more like terror. The bedding was called, Edmure was carried off. And then, the music changed. The band struck up a song Jon did not recognize at first, a slow, mournful melody in a minor key, with words about a lord who cast his enemies down and drowned their halls in blood. The Rains of Castamere, the Lannister anthem, the song that Tywin played when he wanted someone to know that the killing was about to start. Jon was on his feet before the crossbows appeared. Now. He shouted, and his voice carried across the hall like a war horn, and the 30 hidden men drew their blades, and the world came apart. Crossbow bolts slammed into the tables. A northern lord, Small Jon Umber, took a bolt in the shoulder and roared and flipped the table onto its side, creating a barricade. Frey soldiers poured through the doors with swords drawn. The musicians dropped their instruments and pulled crossbows from beneath the gallery railing. But Barristan's men were already in the corridors. Jon heard the sound of steel on steel above him, and then a scream, and then another, and the crossbow fire from the gallery sputtered and stopped as the hidden men cut the Frey bowmen down from behind. The hall became a slaughterhouse. Jon fought with the calm, lethal precision of a man who had trained for this moment his entire life. The first Frey soldier who reached him died before he could raise his blade, Jon's hidden knife in his throat, followed by the man's own sword snatched from his falling hand. He killed the second with a downward cut that split the man's shield arm. He killed the third and fourth in rapid succession, moving through the room like a river through a broken dam, finding the gaps, pouring through them, leaving ruin behind. Across the hall, Barristan fought. The old knight was 67 years old, and he fought like 20. His sword moved in arcs so fast they blurred, a white ghost cutting through crimson and blue, and the Frey soldiers fell around him like wheat before a scythe. 3 men rushed him at once, and he killed all 3 in 4 strokes. A block, a thrust, a spin, a cut. And when a 4th came from behind, he caught the blade on his arm guard and drove his pommel into the man's face with a crunch that echoed above the roar of battle. Robb fought in the center. Grey Wind was not with him, and without the wolf he was more vulnerable than Jon would have liked, but Robb was Ned Stark's son, and Barristan's student, and he did not panic. He drew his sword and rallied the northern lords around him, and together they formed a ring of steel that the Freys broke against like waves against a cliff. The kennelmen did their work. Grey Wind came through the side door like a thunderbolt wrapped in fur. 6 feet of direwolf, snarling, teeth bared, eyes burning gold, and hit the Frey line with an impact that scattered soldiers like 9-pins. Men screamed. Men ran. The wolf tore through armored men as though the armor were paper, and the fear of it, the primal, animal terror of a predator that no blade could stop, broke the Frey assault faster than any sword could. Jon saw Roose Bolton. The Lord of the Dreadfort stood near the rear of the hall, behind the Frey lines, wearing armor beneath his feast clothes, which told Jon everything he needed to confirm about Bolton's role in the betrayal. Bolton had a knife in his hand, and he was moving toward Robb with the careful, unhurried stride of a man who had planned this moment to the minute. Jon shouted a warning. Catelyn, who was near Robb and bleeding from a cut on her arm, turned and saw Bolton coming and screamed, a sound that was not fear, but something older and fiercer. a mother's fury at the thing that threatened her child. Bolton lunged. Jon was too far away to intercept the blade, but Catelyn was not. She threw herself between Bolton and Robb, and the knife that was meant for the king in the north caught her across the side of the throat. A shallow cut that sprayed blood, but missed the artery by a finger's width. Jon reached Bolton 2 seconds later. The Lord of the Dreadfort turned to meet him, and for a moment their eyes locked. Bolton's pale and cold and empty, Jon's dark and burning, and full of every lesson Barristan had ever taught about what a sword is for. The fight was over in 3 exchanges. Bolton was a schemer, not a swordsman. Jon disarmed him with the bind and twist, the same technique he had used on Darren Hornwood in the yard at Winterfell a lifetime ago, and put the point of his sword against Bolton's throat. "Yield," Jon said. Bolton's pale eyes flickered, calculating even now, searching for an angle. Finding none. "I yield." Around them, the battle was ending. The Freys were broken. Grey wind had shattered their morale, and the northern counterattack had done the rest. Walder Frey was dragged from his seat at the high table by 2 northern soldiers, his wrinkled face twisted with fury and disbelief. His sons, Lothar and Black Walder, the architects of the massacre, lay dead on the floor, killed by the great Jon Umber, who had pulled the crossbow bolt from his own shoulder and used it as a dagger. The hall was full of bodies. The floors were slick with blood. The rains of Castamere still echoed in the rafters, fading, dying, consumed by the silence that followed slaughter. Robb stood in the center of it all, alive, unhurt, his sword red to the hilt, his face showing something that was not triumph, but its opposite, a grief so deep it looked like calm. It was over. The trap had sprung, and the prey had bitten back, and the twins belonged to the wolves now. But the cost was not small, and the war was not won. Dawn found the twins draped in a silence that was not peace, but exhaustion, the heavy, ringing quiet that comes after violence has spent itself and left nothing but the inventory of what it took. Jon walked the great hall as the first light came through the narrow windows. The bodies had been moved, Frey dead to the yard, Northern dead to the sept, but the blood remained, drying in dark pools across the flagstones, soaking into the rushes. He counted the stains the way a soldier counts debts, each one representing a man who had fought and fallen because a king broke his word and an old lord decided to answer betrayal with murder. 37 Northerners dead, 2 lords among them, the elder Norrie and a Flint chieftain whose name Jon had heard once and could not recall. 60 Frey soldiers, including both of Walder Frey's most capable sons. 11 musicians who had not been musicians at all, but crossbowmen in minstrels' clothing. 4 of Barristan's hidden men, killed in the galleries before they could silence the bowmen. And Catelyn. She lived. But the cut across her throat had taken something more than blood. The wound was shallow. Maester Vyman stitched it and said she would recover. But she lay on a cot in a chamber above the hall, staring at the ceiling with eyes that held no expression at all, her hand on the bandage, her breathing slow and even and utterly empty of the fierce, protective fury that had defined her for as long as Jon had known her. When Jon came to see her, she looked at him for a long time without speaking. Her fingers moved on the bandage, tracing the line of the cut. "You saw it coming," she said. Her voice was a rasp, the wound making speech painful. "Sir Barristan saw it coming. You prepared. You armed the men. You posted the wolf." "Yes." Catelyn closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something in them had shifted. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not the erasure of 15 years of cold silence and banished meals, and a resentment so deep it had become part of the architecture of her life. But something, an acknowledgement that had no word in any language Jon spoke. A look that said, "You saved my son, and I will carry that. And it does not change what you are, but it changes what I owe you. Thank you," she said. Jon nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He left the room and stood in the corridor and pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall and breathed until the tightness in his chest released. Because Catelyn Stark had spoken 2 words to him that she had never spoken before, and the weight of them was almost more than he could bear. Robb held court in the Great Hall that afternoon. Walder Frey was brought before him in chains, a withered old man whose fury had curdled into something pathetic, the impotent rage of a schemer whose scheme had failed, who had gambled everything on a single night of blood and lost. "You violated guest right," Robb said. His voice carried no anger. It carried something worse, a flatness, a finality, the voice of a king who had looked into the face of his own death and emerged on the other side too tired for rage. "You murdered men who ate your bread and salt. You conspired with Roose Bolton and Tywin Lannister to destroy a king under your own roof." Walder Frey spat. "You broke your oath first. Boy, you swore to marry my daughter, and you married a Westerling girl instead. I gave you passage across my river. I gave you my swords, and you spat on my family. So don't stand there in your crown and lecture me about broken oaths." The hall was silent. Robb looked at the old man, and Jon saw something move across his brother's face. Not guilt, but recognition. The terrible, clarifying recognition of a man who understands that the disaster he narrowly survived was a disaster he helped to create. "He's not wrong," Robb said later, when the hall was empty and the Freys were locked in their own dungeons and the Northern Army was camped on both sides of the river, licking its wounds. "I broke my word first. Everything that happened tonight, every man who died on that floor, died because I couldn't keep a promise." "Yes," Jon said. There was no point in softening it. Robb needed truth now, not comfort. Barristan stood by the window, watching the river move in the grey afternoon light. His sword was cleaned and sheathed, but his hands bore cuts from the fighting, and one eye was swollen where a Frey soldier had caught him with the flat of a blade, a blow that would have killed a younger, less experienced man and had merely inconvenienced the old knight. "The alliance with the Freys is gone," Barristan said. "Bolton's network in the north is exposed. Tywin will learn that his plan failed, and he will devise a new one. The realm does not stop moving because you survived a night that should have killed you." "What do I do?" Robb asked. He meant it. The arrogance of the young king, the certainty that he could fight his way through anything, had been burned out of him on the floor of the twins, and what remained was something rawer and more honest. A boy asking for help. "You hold what you have," Barristan said. "The North, the Riverlands, the loyalty of the lords who fought beside you tonight. You send envoys to Stannis, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. 2 kings against the Lannisters are stronger than 1. And you remember, for the rest of your life, that the oath you broke almost destroyed everything your father built." Robb nodded. The lesson had been paid for in blood. He would not forget it. The Raven arrived at the twins on the morning of the 3rd day after the failed wedding, while Jon was in the yard overseeing repairs to the gatehouse, and Barristan was drilling the guards who would hold the castle once the Northern Army moved on. The message was from Castle Black, written in Maester Aemon's shaking hand, the words cramped and urgent and carrying a desperation that ink should not be able to hold. Jon read it standing in the yard, with the autumn wind pulling at his cloak and the sounds of hammers and horses and soldiers going about the business of survival all around him. The Night's Watch was under siege. Mance Rayder had united the wildling clans, 100,000 strong, the letter said. Women and children among them, fleeing something they would not name, and the horde was moving south toward the wall. Castle Black was undermanned. Eastwatch was worse. The Shadow Tower had sent its last reserves weeks ago. The Watch was begging for reinforcements from anywhere, anyone, any lord who remembered that the wall existed and cared enough to send men to hold it. But that was not the part of the letter that turned Jon's blood to ice. The final lines were different. The hand that had written them was not Aemon's. It was rougher, more urgent, the letters carved into the parchment as though the writer had been pressing too hard, trying to force the meaning through the paper itself. They are coming. Not the wildlings. Something else, something that should not exist. The dead are walking beyond the wall. We have seen them. 3 ranging parties lost. 2 brothers returned with wounds that would not bleed. Commander Mormont orders all reserves to Castle Black immediately. Jon lowered the letter. The wind moved across the yard, and the hammers rang, and the world went on as though nothing had changed. And everything had changed. And Jon stood in the center of it and felt a door opening inside his chest. Not the door of grief or rage or the slow accumulation of war's weight, but something older and darker. A door he had felt rattling on its hinges since boyhood. Since old Nan's stories about the long night. Since the dreams he sometimes had of cold so deep it burned. Of blue eyes watching from a darkness that had no end. He found Robb in the great hall, sitting with Catelyn and the remaining lords, planning the next phase of the war. Jon handed him the letter without speaking. Robb read it. His face went through 3 changes: confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, settling recognition that this was real. "The dead," Robb said. "The dead. Jon. The war. The war in the south won't matter if the wall falls." Jon heard his own voice, as though it came from far away, from the bottom of a well or the top of a tower, echoing with a certainty he had not earned and could not explain. "Robb, listen to me. Whatever Tywin is planning, whatever the Lannisters do next, none of it matters if what's beyond the wall reaches this side. You've heard the stories. You grew up with the same stories I did. Old Nan told us about the others, and the endless night, and the wall that was built to hold them back, and we thought they were tales for children, but the Night's Watch is sending ravens to every castle in Westeros saying, 'The dead are walking,' and these are not men who frighten at shadows." Robb stared at him. The hall was very quiet. "I need to go north," Jon said. "I need you here. You have Barristan. You have the Great Jon and the Blackfish and 20,000 men who would die for you. The wall has 1,000 brothers, and whatever farmers and thieves they can scrape together before 100,000 wildlings and something worse arrive at their gates." He stepped closer. Father always said the wall was the real fight. He didn't say it often, but when he did, his voice changed. Like he was talking about something he'd seen, not something he'd been told. "The real fight is up there, Robb. It always has been." Robb looked at Catelyn. She sat with her hand on her bandaged throat, her eyes moving between her sons, the king and the bastard, the true-born heir and the boy she had spent 15 years trying to push out of her family. Her mouth opened, and what came out surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "Let him go." Robb turned to her. "Mother, let him go." Her voice was rough from the wound, but steady. "If what's in that letter is true, then everything we're fighting for down here is a game played on a board that's about to be swept off the table. Send him north. Send him with whatever men you can spare, and pray to whatever gods still listen that the wall holds." Robb looked at Jon for a long time. Then he crossed the space between them and gripped his brother's arms and pulled him close. "Come back," Robb said, his voice cracking. "I will. That's an order from your king. Then I'd better obey it." They held each other. Then Robb released him and stepped back and became the king again, and Jon became the soldier again, and the brothers who had grown up together in Winterfell's yard, sparring, laughing, bleeding, growing, looked at each other across a gulf that was about to widen into something neither of them could cross, and neither of them looked away. Jon left the twins that afternoon with 200 men, northern soldiers, volunteers, men who had heard the stories about the wall and wanted to fight something that mattered more than politics. Barristan rode with him. "You don't have to come," Jon told him as they cleared the gates. "I've spent 9 years training you," Barristan said. "I did not spend 9 years building the finest swordsman in the realm so he could ride into the dark without someone at his back. You could stay with Robb. He needs you. Robb is a king. Kings have advisors and lords and councils. You're riding towards something that no one in living memory has faced. You need me more." He paused. The road stretched north ahead of them, straight and grey, running toward a horizon that was already darker than the day warranted. "Besides, I'm old, Jon. I have fought in every war this realm has offered me, and I have served every king who sat the Iron Throne, and none of it ever felt like the fight I was meant for. This does." They rode north. The column moved at a steady pace, not rushed, not dawdling. The ground-eating march of men who understood that urgency and haste were not the same thing. The land changed around them. The green of the riverlands gave way to the grey and brown of the north, and the air sharpened, and the nights grew longer, and the stars burned with a cold, distant fire that reminded Jon of the sky above Winterfell's battlements, where he had stood at 14 and looked up and felt something enormous approaching that he could not yet name. He could name it now. On the 5th night, they camped at the edge of a forest where the trees grew thick enough to block the sky. Jon sat by the fire and cleaned his sword, running the whetstone along the edge with the same slow, careful rhythm Barristan had taught him in the first year. Stroke, turn, stroke, turn, the blade singing under the stone. Barristan sat across from him, his own sword across his knees, and in the firelight the old knight looked his age for the first time Jon could remember. The lines in his face were deep. The shadows beneath his eyes were dark. He was 67 years old, and he had ridden to war more times than most men had ridden to market, and the road ahead was longer and harder and colder than any he had travelled. "I never asked you," Jon said. "That first day in the yard at Winterfell, when you saw me fighting, what did you see?" Barristan looked at the fire. The flames moved across his face, and his expression was the one Jon had spent 9 years trying to read, the expression of a man carrying a truth he had never spoken. "I saw a boy," Barristan said, "fighting like someone I had lost, moving like a ghost I had failed. And I thought, if the gods have any mercy, if there is any justice left in this broken world, maybe I can save this one. Maybe I can do for this boy what I could not do for the man he reminds me of." "Who?" The fire cracked. Sparks rose into the dark. "Someone who deserved better than the world gave him," Barristan said. "Someone who would have been a great king if the realm had let him. Someone whose name I will tell you one day, when the time is right, and the truth will not destroy you." Jon held the old knight's gaze across the fire. The shadows moved between them. The forest pressed close, and Jon did not ask again, because Barristan had taught him patience, and because the truth, whatever it was, however large and heavy and old, would keep. They rode on in the morning, north, always north, toward the wall and the cold and the darkness that waited behind it. Jon thought of his father. He thought of Robb, standing in the twins with his crown and his grief. He thought of Sansa, still captive in King's Landing. He thought of Arya, lost somewhere in the Riverlands with a sword called Needle and a fury that no one had taught her how to channel. He thought of Bran and Rickon, reported dead, mourned and buried in the hearts of everyone who loved them. He thought of Barristan, the old knight riding beside him, straight-backed, steady-eyed, his white cloak long since abandoned, but his white purpose undiminished. A man who had spent his life guarding kings and had found, at the end of it, something worth guarding more. The road narrowed, the trees thinned. The wind came from the north, carrying a cold that cut through wool and leather and bone. A cold that did not belong to autumn, a cold that smelled of nothing. No pine, no smoke, no earth. Only the absolute absence of warmth, the void that exists before the world begins and after the world ends. Jon pulled his cloak tighter and kept riding. Beside him, Barristan did the same. The wall was waiting. Whatever came next, the battle, the darkness, the long night that old Nan had promised and the maesters had denied, Jon would face it the way Barristan had taught him. Not with rage, and not with fear, and not with the desperate hope that the world would be fair, but with steel in his hand and purpose in his heart, and the steady, unshakable knowledge that a knight is not a title or a name or a suit of white armor. A knight is a man who stands between the darkness and the people who cannot stand for themselves. Jon Snow rode north. The greatest knight who ever lived rode beside him. And ahead of them, beyond the wall, in the frozen reaches where no living man had ventured in 1,000 years, something ancient and patient and hungry stirred in the ice and turned its blue gaze south and waited.